What if the beginning of human history is only the part that survived? It is a quiet question, the kind that arrives late at night when the world has softened and the noise of certainty has finally gone still. You find it waiting for you in museum galleries filled with broken tablets, in excavation reports from southern Iraq, in the patient work of archaeologists brushing dust from ancient clay. It waits in the British Museum, in the Iraq Museum, in the study of cuneiform signs pressed by hands that vanished thousands of years ago. It lingers in the oldest myths from Sumer, where the first cities seem already to stand at the far edge of memory, as though something older had once been known and then allowed to fade. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you settle in, I would love for you to leave a comment with your location and your local time, so that somewhere in the dark, this little circle of night listeners can find each other. Now imagine the earth beneath your feet still warm from the day. The wind moves low over the plain. Reeds whisper at the edge of dark water, and beyond them the land of ancient Mesopotamia lies under a sky so wide it seems to remember every age that passed beneath it. There is no highway sound here, no electric glow, only the slow gleam of stars above canals and marshes, above mud-brick walls and temple steps, above a world that would one day be called the cradle of civilization, and yet even that famous phrase carries a hidden assumption. A cradle is a beginning. It suggests that here, at last, humanity started to remember itself. But what if the cradle was only the first thing we kept? What if the deeper beginning belonged to a chapter too damaged, too altered, or too carefully buried to survive in full? You walk, in your mind, through the alluvial lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where city after city rose from silt and labour. Uruk, often described as one of the earliest true cities in the world, expanded here in the 4th millennium BCE with monumental buildings, administrative systems, and some of the earliest known writing. That much belongs to accepted history. Clay tablets from this region preserve lists, rations, offerings, names, and transactions. They show not a fantasy world, but a practical one. Grain had to be counted. Workers had to be fed. Temples had to store wealth. Human life had already become organized, measured, written down. But the strange thing is that once writing appears, memory does not begin simply and cleanly. It arrives already crowded. The earliest stories do not speak like people inventing the universe from scratch. They speak like inheritors. They speak as if the great arrangement of things was already old, already sacred, already partly beyond explanation. In Sumerian tradition, kingship is said in some texts to have descended from heaven, not invented, not negotiated, not gradually improvised, but descended. The phrase is famous, and scholars debate how literally it was ever meant to be taken. Perhaps it was only a poetic way of framing royal legitimacy. Perhaps it was liturgy wrapped around power. But the wording remains curious. It carries the scent of a structure introduced, not discovered. You move closer to the temples now, those towering platforms that later generations would call ziggurats. In their mature form, they belong mostly to later periods, but temple sites in southern Mesopotamia stretch far back into the Ubaid and Uruk eras, into centuries where the line between civic administration and sacred duty was almost impossible to separate. The temple was not merely a place to pray, it was storehouse, workshop, archive, and symbol of cosmic order. To step into such a place would have been to enter a managed universe, a world in which grain, labour, ritual, and authority formed one continuous system. That is one of the grounded details that makes the old myths feel so strangely alive. The gods in Mesopotamian literature often behave like rulers of a complicated household. They assign tasks, they establish offices, they divide responsibilities, they build, decree, flood, judge, and remember. Scholars usually read this as myth reflecting the social world that produced it. Human institutions shaped divine imagination. Cities built heavenly governments in their own image. That is a reasonable and well-accepted view. And still, in the quiet hours, Another possibility hovers at the edge of the record. Some have wondered whether these stories preserve not just imagination, but distorted memory. Not memory in the modern sense of eyewitness fact, but cultural memory, the kind that survives after details have crumbled away. If a society inherited rituals, hierarchies, and sacred explanations from peoples long forgotten, then myths might serve as containers for systems older than the cities that wrote them down. The record is fragmentary. The speculation remains speculation. Yet the feeling persists that the first scribes were not inventing everything they described. They were inheriting a library with most of its shelves already empty. You kneel beside a tablet in your thoughts. Its edges are chipped, its signs are partial. Whole lines have vanished where the clay broke away. This is how the ancient world often reaches you, not as a complete sentence, but as a wound. Assyriologists and historians spend years reconstructing such fragments, comparing duplicates, filling gaps cautiously, resisting the temptation to make the broken parts say too much. That restraint matters. It keeps the story honest. But it also means you are left with silences, and silence has its own power. In Mesopotamian king lists, for example, there are rulers before the Great Flood whose reigns stretch for astonishing lengths of time. Mainstream scholarship tends to interpret these numbers symbolically, ideologically, or mathematically, rather than literally. The enormous reign lengths may express prestige, cosmic antiquity, or the distance between mythic and historical time. Yet even read that way, they reveal something important. The people preserving these records wanted the beginning to feel unreachable. They wanted a deep age before the age of ordinary men, an era that already seemed faded and immense. Perhaps that was simple literary grandeur. It may be that ancient scribes, like storytellers everywhere, understood the emotional power of distance. But some readers have wondered whether the exaggerated spans hide the memory of sequence rather than duration. Not immortal kings, perhaps, but many forgotten cycles compressed into one impossible horizon. Scholars remain divided on how such texts should be interpreted. The numbers are not transparent. The intention behind them is uncertain, and uncertainty, in this kind of story, is not a flaw. It is the doorway. You keep walking through the darkness of the plain. The smell of wet clay rises where canal water touches the bank. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks near a sleeping enclosure. Smoke from a bitumen fire drifts low and bitter. The stars above this ancient land are the same stars you know, but without the names you learned in childhood. Here they belong to a sky watched by priests, farmers, rulers, and labourers, all of them living inside a world that seemed recently ordered and yet impossibly old. What unsettles you most is not the idea of gods descending or ancient beings ruling, or cities receiving sacred plans from heaven. Ancient cultures everywhere told stories in grand language. What unsettles you is the repeated sense that the first civilizations felt themselves to be late. Even when they stood at the dawn of writing, they seemed to look backward. They collected old traditions. They copied older hymns. They tied power to origins already distant. It is as if the first people who could truly preserve memory were already haunted by the fear that they had arrived after something essential had been forgotten. And that is where the question settles beside you tonight. Not whether every myth is fact, not whether every strange reading should be believed, but whether humanity, at the moment it first learned to write itself into history, was already writing from inside an amnesia. Perhaps the oldest creators, if such beings ever existed in memory at all, had already been softened into gods by the time the tablets were made. It is possible that early priests were preserving echoes of systems they no longer understood. Some have wondered whether the sacred order of temple life, kingship, labour, and ritual was less an invention than a reconstruction of something inherited from an age no longer remembered. Or perhaps none of that is true, and what you are hearing is only the timeless human instinct to imagine a lost beginning grander than the present. But as the torchlight lowers and the night wind moves across the reeds, the question remains, what if the first creators were not erased from history because they never existed, but because humanity was never meant to remember them clearly at all? The morning begins not with a city, but with mud. You feel it under your bare feet at the river's edge, cool and thick where the reeds lean over dark water. The land before you is flat enough to make distance feel uncertain. Marsh birds lift and settle. Insects trace circles above the shallows. A pale mist hangs low over the canals, and beyond it the open plain waits beneath a sky that will soon turn white with heat. This is southern Mesopotamia before history feels fixed, before stone monuments dominate the horizon, before later empires write their names across the earth. Here, everything seems made from river gift and human patience. The first thing you notice is how soft the world is. Clay walls, reed roofs, baskets of rushes drying in the sun, boats stitched from bundled stalks and sealed with bitumen. Even the scent of the place feels unfinished. Part water, part wet soil, part smoke from slow fires fed with reeds and dung. Civilizations elsewhere would build in stone and leave behind a harder kind of memory. Here, memory has to be remade every season, because Earth returns to Earth quickly. A wall collapses, a platform sinks, a roof must be rethatched. The river shifts and asks for labour all over again. That softness matters. It changes how you imagine the earliest people who lived here. They're not standing in front of giant carved monuments announcing themselves to eternity. They are making the conditions for life in a difficult plane. Archaeologists have long noted that southern Mesopotamia offered rich agricultural potential, but only if water could be guided, stored, and shared. Irrigation did not appear as a neat invention in a single moment. It developed over time through canals, ditches, embankments, and seasonal understanding. To live here was to cooperate with mud, water, and uncertainty. You move inland a little, following a narrow raised path between fields. Men and women bend in the distance. A child carries a small jar. The air smells green at first, then bitter where bitumen has been heated for repair work. There is no dramatic revelation in such a scene, only the slow truth that civilizations begin as repeated tasks, seeds pressed into damp ground, water diverted by hand, grain harvested, stored, measured. The mainstream historical picture is clear enough on this point. From the Ubaid period onward, settlements in Mesopotamia show increasing complexity in architecture, craft specialization, exchange, and communal organization. Villages became larger. Sacred spaces became more distinct. Administrative habits slowly emerged. The landscape was taught to feed concentration of power. And yet, as you walk through this ancient setting in your mind, it becomes hard not to feel that the place itself invites older stories. There is something about the marsh horizon, about the endless bands of water and sedge and low-rising sun, that makes the boundary between practical life and sacred imagination feel very thin. If you woke before dawn here, saw mist lifting off black water, heard unseen birds crying in the reeds, watched the first torch near a shrine flicker in the blue half-light, you might not need much encouragement to believe that unseen presences shared the land with you. The oldest Mesopotamian myths do not emerge from a dry desert emptiness. They come from a world of flood channels, fertile silt, storm skies, and night stars reflected in water. The environment is everywhere in the imagination. Fresh water and salt water become primordial principles in later Babylonian tradition. Marshes and riverbanks shape the materials of daily life. Even the gods of wisdom, creation, and order are often linked to the deep, the waters below, the hidden places from which form rises. This does not prove any secret history. It does, however, explain why beginnings here feel less like a single event and more like something emerging from depths. You reach a settlement as the day warms. Its houses cluster low and close, rectangular rooms joined around courtyards where grinding stones sit near jars of grain. Excavated sites from early Mesopotamia show such domestic patterns clearly enough. Households, organized work, food preparation, storage, weaving, and care. Life was collective, rhythmic, and exposed to both the generosity and the cruelty of the environment. There would have been laughter here, exhaustion, ritual, jealousy, hunger, births and ordinary arguments. Any mystery that grows from this land has to stay rooted in that human texture, or it becomes hollow. At the centre of the settlement, a raised structure catches your attention. Not enormous, not yet the towering temple platform of a later imagination, but set apart, larger, more carefully built, a place where offerings might gather and authority might become visible. Archaeologists studying Ubaid and Uruk sites have long observed the increasing prominence of temple institutions in the development of Mesopotamian urban life. Religion and administration were not easily separated. To bring grain, oil, wool, or labour into sacred space was also to participate in organised power, and this is where the unsettling thought begins to form, not as a shout, but as a whisper. What if the first experience of order did not feel entirely human? You have to be careful with that question. There is no scholarly consensus saying that early Mesopotamians remembered literal non-human founders. Accepted history does not require such an idea. Human societies are fully capable of building hierarchy, ritual, and administration on their own. But when later myths speak of divine plans, sacred decrees, and ordered roles descending into the human world, they may reflect a genuine emotional memory of living inside systems that felt older and larger than any single generation. A person born into canal labour, temple offerings, and sacred festivals might well experience order as something given rather than invented. The wind shifts, heat gathers over the plain, you can smell fish drying somewhere near the water. A woman carries reeds on her shoulder. Men patch a levee where the bank has softened. A priest or temple worker passes with a shaved scalp and a linen garment dusted faintly at the hem. Nothing in the scene is impossible. Nothing requires hidden beings, and still the atmosphere encourages another layer of thought. Some fringe interpreters have suggested that ancient floodplains like this preserved faint cultural memories of instruction from mysterious civilizers, beings later transformed into gods, sages, or founders. Scholars generally reject literalized versions of that idea, seeing them as modern projection, yet the persistence of culture heroes, divine planners, and sacred bringers of order across ancient traditions leaves one question unresolved. Why do so many early societies imagine civilization as taught from above or from elsewhere? No single answer satisfies everyone. Some say it is the natural logic of authority. Others say it reflects the awe inspired by the first complex institutions. Still others think it encodes inherited stories from migrations, contacts, or vanished local traditions whose details can no longer be recovered. The record is incomplete. The earliest layers of southern Mesopotamian life do not explain themselves fully. Many settlements remain only partially excavated. Organic materials are lost. Whole centuries must be inferred from potsherds, walls, tools, and silent ground. That silence becomes part of the landscape as the sun climbs. It presses down on the open spaces between settlements. It settles over the canals where the water moves without speaking. It gathers on abandoned walls that will, after enough seasons, collapse into mounds and become part of the earth again. The Arabic term tel, used for settlement mounds across the Near East, describes exactly this kind of layered forgetting. One town crumbles, another rises atop it. Floors become buried. Hearths disappear beneath new foundations. The land stores human time in stacked silence. You stand on one of those future mounds in imagination and realize something simple but unnerving. The first cities were not built on blank earth. Even when they seemed new, they often rested on older occupation. Beneath every confident beginning there may already have been a memory of lives, structures, and practices half submerged. Before the first city you can name, there may have been smaller centres. Before formal writing, there were symbols, tokens, seals, marks, habits of counting. Before temples dominated the skyline, sacred focus had already been gathering. Perhaps that is all the mystery you need tonight. Not lost super beings, not vanished machines, not dramatic revelation, but the quieter idea that origins are never as clean as later people pretend. Human beings arrive in inherited worlds. Even the first scribes, even the first builders of monumental cities, likely lived among traces they did not fully understand. They shaped mud into walls, gods into names, and labour into order, but the land beneath them was already old. As evening comes, the light turns bronze over the reed beds. Water catches the sky and holds it for a moment. Smoke rises straight up before the wind changes, in that ancient softness where everything can sink, erode, or be built again. You begin to sense why remembering would always be fragile here. A world like this does not keep the first chapter easily. It asks for repetition instead, and repetition, over centuries, can preserve a structure long after the reason for it has been forgotten. By night, the tablets look almost alive. You imagine them laid out in rows inside a temple room or palace archive, their surfaces catching firelight in uneven flashes, each one holding the pressure of a reed stylus made thousands of years ago. Some are small enough to rest in a palm, others are broad administrative records, school texts, hymns, lexical lists, contracts, omens, and royal inscriptions. Their edges are blunt, their corners softened, their lines sometimes clear and sometimes damaged beyond recovery. They do not feel like books. They feel like pieces of dried earth that learned how to speak. This is one of the most remarkable things about ancient Mesopotamia. Among the earliest writing systems known to history, cuneiform began not as poetry, but as accounting. By the late 4th millennium BCE, in places such as Uruk, signs and numerical impressions were being used to track goods, labour, and storage, sheep, barley, oil, beer, textiles. The practical needs of large institutions pressed language into visible form. Scholars have long emphasized that writing emerged from administration, from the need to control information in increasingly complex societies. It was, at first, less a song than a ledger, and yet, once writing exists, it refuses to stay practical for long. The same medium that records rations and deliveries eventually preserves laments for ruined cities, debates between personified seasons, hymns to deities, royal boasts, flood stories, love poems, medical instructions, incantations, school exercises, and lists of kings reaching backward into near impossibility. You sit in the half-light with these tablets around you and realize that the human wish to remember became entangled almost immediately with the human wish to order the world. The archive was never just storage, it was selection. That is where the quiet tension enters, because what survives in clay is not the whole of the past. It is the past that institutions found worth fixing, copying, reciting, and protecting. Temple schools trained scribes to preserve particular traditions. Palaces commemorated particular rulers. Cities honoured their own gods and lineages. What was written down had already passed through power before it reached your eyes. The ancient record feels precious for that reason, but also incomplete in a very deliberate way. You picture a young scribe kneeling on woven matting, turning a damp tablet toward the light. He copies signs he did not invent, in a language already older than his own speech. He learns set phrases, divine names, standard lists, and formulaic openings. In Mesopotamian scribal education, copying was essential. Students practiced signs again and again. Lexical lists arranged the world into categories. Mastery meant entering a line of transmission. The knowledge did not belong to the student. It belonged to tradition. There is something calming in that image, but something unsettling too. The scribe is preserving memory, yes, yet he is also narrowing it. Oral variation becomes written form. Living stories become authorized versions. By the time myths are inscribed, they are no longer simply tales told around hearths. They are cultural decisions. That matters when you read the great old narratives now. Take the Sumerian king list, with its rulers before the flood and dynasties shifting from city to city, as if kingship were a sacred object passed by unseen decree. Historians do not treat the text as a straightforward historical chronicle. Parts of it reflect real rulers and political aspirations, while other parts are clearly ideological, symbolic, or legendary. The document tries to make the past orderly. It gives succession where the ground probably held overlap, conflict, fragmentation, and forgotten branches. It presents continuity as though continuity were natural. Perhaps that was a political project. It may be that the list helped later regimes imagine legitimacy by tying themselves to a sacred chain of rulership. That is the mainstream reading in broad terms, and it makes sense. But some have wondered whether texts like this also preserve broken echoes of an older memory structure, one in which authority was always imagined as descending through appointed phases. Not proof of supernatural kings, certainly. Not evidence in a modern scientific sense. More like the fossil shape of an older worldview, still visible even after the details have worn away. The room grows warmer in your imagination. Wax smoke curls upward from a lamp. Someone nearby smooths fresh clay with wet fingers. Outside, the city has fallen quieter. A dog moves along a wall. Water drips somewhere in a jar room. And here, among tablets, you begin to feel how fragile all preservation is. Fire can bake clay and save it. Fire can also destroy archives. Flood can bury records and protect them. Flood can also erase whole sites. What survives may do so by accident as often as by intention. Accidental survival is one of the great conditions of ancient history. Entire libraries are gone. Whole cities remain unexcavated or inaccessible. Thousands of tablets were broken in antiquity, scattered, reused, or sold without context. Even the famous discoveries of the modern era, from Nineveh's royal collections to temple archives at sites like Nippur, reveal only slices of what once existed. Scholars reconstruct epics from fragments found in different places and periods. A line from one tablet helps complete a gap in another. A version in Akkadian sheds light on an older Sumerian form. Meaning returns in pieces, and when meaning returns in pieces, imagination naturally gathers around the gaps. There are curious fringe ideas that the broken state of so many ancient records is itself suspicious, as if crucial knowledge about humanity's true beginnings was intentionally shattered or hidden. Most historians would reject that claim. Time, conquest, neglect, reuse, damp, looting, and plain chance are more than enough to explain the damage. Still, the feeling can be hard to shake when you encounter text after text that gestures toward deep origins while refusing to tell the story plainly. Not because someone necessarily censored it, but because the ancient world did not preserve knowledge for your convenience. It preserved what mattered to its own survival and ritual life. So you begin to read not only what the tablets say, but how they say it. Creation accounts often describe arrangement rather than invention. Gods divide realms, roles are assigned, boundaries are fixed, humans appear in relation to labour, service, maintenance, or sacred order. This is not the language of random emergence, it is the language of system. Scholars have interpreted this in many ways. Some see it as reflecting the institutional life of temple economies. Others emphasize the political theology of city-states and kingship. Comparative mythologists note parallels and differences across the ancient Near East, tracing how motifs moved and changed. Yet no interpretation entirely dissolves the strange tone of these texts. They sound less like people wondering how existence began, and more like people remembering that the world had once been set in order by intelligences prior to themselves. Maybe that is simply how agricultural civilizations think. A managed society imagines a managed cosmos. That is one sensible explanation. But another, more speculative reading lingers at the edge. It is possible that some myths preserve cultural memory of receiving systems already shaped by forgotten predecessors, whether neighbouring peoples, vanished elites, or traditions so old that their human origin faded into sacred distance. In that reading, gods become the final names attached to the anonymous architects of order. No one can prove such a thing. The evidence is too fragmentary. The chain of transmission is too long. Scholars remain cautious for good reason, but caution does not cancel wonder. It only keeps wonder honest. You run your fingers in thought across a tablet's impressed wedges. Each sign is a decision, each line a rescue, each break a silence that survived beside the words. The ancient scribes were not writing for you, and yet you sit here now, centuries beyond the collapse of their cities, trying to hear what was important enough to harden in clay. Not everything was. Most voices never reached a tablet. Farmers, labourers, mothers, boatmen, and singers lived entire lives outside the archive unless power needed their numbers, names, or offerings. The written record is therefore both miraculous and incomplete. It gives civilization a voice, but never the whole chorus. And perhaps that is why the oldest questions remain so persistent. If humanity once had a first story about its makers, would it have survived in full, or would it have reached the scribes already damaged, softened into ritual phrases, folded into hymns, scattered among lists, hidden inside metaphors of heaven, water, kingship, and service? The lamp burns lower, the clay cools. In the deep quiet of the archive, you can almost believe that memory itself was treated like grain or oil, stored in measured portions, guarded by institutions, and distributed only in forms the culture could bear. What was too large, too old, or too unsettling may not have been destroyed. It may simply have been reduced to fragments and passed on that way. There are ages the ancient world names, and ages it only seems to glance toward. You feel that distinction most clearly when you stand in imagination between the known and the half-known, where archaeology still offers pottery, foundations, burials, and tools. But the stories begin to blur into sacred distance. The cities of southern Mesopotamia can be arranged in sequences. Scholars can discuss Ubaid, Uruk, Jemdet Nasser, early dynastic. They can point to changing ceramics, temple forms, seal impressions, administrative habits, and the gradual emergence of urban life. This is the measured side of the past, the side built from excavation layers and comparison. It gives you confidence. It tells you that history, though incomplete, has structure. But then the old texts begin to speak, and structure grows strange. You hear of times before named dynasties, before the familiar rhythm of kings ruling walled cities, before the scribes who copied the stories you now possess. There are phrases that carry a kind of ceremonial fog. In an age before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven, when the gods established the first places, the language does not always point to dates. It points to distance. It creates a threshold beyond which ordinary chronology becomes sacred memory. That threshold is not unusual in ancient literature. Many cultures begin formal history only after placing a veil across deeper time. Greek traditions had heroic ages. Egyptian thought reached backward into divine and semi-divine rule. Mesopotamian recorders, too, seem aware that the earliest past is qualitatively different from the eras that follow. Historians usually treat this as mythic framing. Mythic time and human time are not meant to be read in the same way. That interpretation is careful and sensible. It protects the record from being forced into crude literalism. And yet, in the stillness of the night, you begin to notice that this mythic framing may also preserve a genuine intuition. The people of the first cities may have felt that the world they inhabited was inherited from a time they could no longer fully describe. Not fantasy in the childish sense. More like a memory of foundations already laid. You imagine a priest climbing temple steps in pre-dawn darkness. The air is cool for a brief moment before sunrise. The mud brick beneath his feet still holds a trace of night. In the sanctuary above, the cult statue waits in silence. Offerings will be arranged, hymns will be recited, fires will be lit, ritual will bind heaven, city, field, and household into one fabric. The priest does not think of himself as creating order. He serves an order that precedes him. It came from ancestors, from divine decree, from beginnings too distant to question casually. This is one of the most grounded facts about ancient ritual life. Tradition carried authority because it was old, whether in temple liturgy, law, kingship, or calendrical practice. Legitimacy often depended on continuity with origins. Mesopotamian rulers rebuilt temples and boasted not only of innovation, but of restoration. They renewed ancient foundations, they recovered forgotten rites, they honoured old plans, Even when political change was dramatic, it was often presented as faithful return. The past was not merely admired, it was a source of cosmic permission. That devotion to origins becomes more interesting when origins are obscure. Take the flood traditions. Versions survive in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, later echoed in other Near Eastern and biblical forms. Scholars debate the relationship among these stories, the degree to which they reflect actual regional flooding, literary borrowing, or symbolic reset. Southern Mesopotamia was certainly shaped by river floods, and there is archaeological evidence of flood deposits at some sites, though not one single universal event that neatly explains every myth. The scholarly picture remains complicated. Still, the narrative function of the flood is clear enough. It divides time. It draws a line between a lost world and the one that followed, and once time has been divided like that, anything before the line becomes difficult to recover in ordinary terms. That is where the hidden timeline begins to feel possible, not as a secret chronology waiting intact to be discovered, but as a damaged sequence dimly perceived through later ordering. Some have wondered whether the flood in Mesopotamian tradition did more than remember water. It may have served as a narrative curtain placed across a much older and more confusing inheritance. Everything before it becomes remote, purified, and hard to test. Everything after it becomes the manageable past of cities, dynasties, and inscriptions. You walk now across a tell at dusk, a settlement mound shaped by centuries of collapse and rebuilding. Archaeologists cut trenches into such mounds and read the earth like layered memory. Floors, ash deposits, broken pottery, wall lines, burials, ceilings, hearths. One era rests on another. Sometimes there are clear breaks. Sometimes continuity is hard to trace. The mound does not offer one beginning. It offers accumulation. This, perhaps, is the real lesson of deep time in Mesopotamia. Origins are layered, and every later generation chooses which layer to call the first. That choice can reshape a civilization's self-understanding. If the earlier scribes inherited old oral traditions about prior ages, they may already have been receiving them in compressed form. Generations of retelling simplify. Ritual stabilizes what narrative once varied. Political needs emphasize some ancestors and forget others. Local gods merge. Names shift across languages. A memory that may once have referred to people, places, or powers could easily become theological by the time it reached clay. Scholars who study comparative mythology often point out how motifs survive while meanings change. The pattern remains even when the explanation does not. This is why the phrase long before recorded history feels both useful and slippery. It describes a real problem. Human life extends far beyond writing. Agriculture, settlement, ritual behavior, and symbolic systems all existed before the first cuneiform tablets. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, much older than the cities of Sumer, reminds modern people that monumental or communal sacred behavior could appear where older models once expected only simplicity. Scholars continue to debate exactly how to interpret such early sites, but they have undeniably expanded the scale of what prehistoric humans could organize and imagine. That alone makes the ancient Mesopotamian claim to beginnings more complex. The first written memory was not the first human sacred world, and once you allow that thought to settle, the old stories from Sumer begin to feel slightly altered. Perhaps when Mesopotamian texts speak of first order, first kingship, first divine arrangements, they are not describing the literal beginning of humanity. Perhaps they are describing the beginning of a remembered system after much older worlds had already passed into silence. It is possible that what later cities called the First Age was only the first age they could still narrate. Some have wondered whether hints of earlier creators, earlier civilizers, or earlier orders were folded into divine myth because their original context had become unreachable. The evidence for such a theory is incomplete, but the logic of memory loss makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. The scholarly uncertainty remains central here. Archaeology is powerful, but uneven. Organic materials decay. Floodplains disturb older strata. Many sites remain unexcavated or inaccessible. Textual traditions survive by chance and copying. There is no perfect timeline waiting beneath the soil. There are only fragments, sequences, patterns, and absences. Night comes slowly over the plain. The smell of dust cools. A canal reflects the first stars. Somewhere nearby, someone seals a jar with clay and cord. Somewhere else, a hymn is being spoken in a language already old to its speaker. You listen from the edge of this imagined world and feel how naturally a civilization can stand at the dawn of writing, while already sensing that it lives after a forgetting. That may be the hidden timeline you are looking for. Not a neat forbidden calendar, not a secret set of dates carved in stone, but a softer and stranger possibility. That the people who first wrote history were already living in the aftermath of deeper ages, and what they called the beginning was only the oldest layer they still knew how to preserve. At some point, the fragments begin to resemble a machine. Not a machine of metal and noise, but one made of offices, rituals, names, boundaries, and repeated acts. You can almost picture it laid out across the ancient world like an invisible frame. A god for fresh water, a god for storm, a god for love and war, a god for wisdom, fertility, writing, shepherding, grain, the moon, the sun, a temple for each divine power, a city under each divine patron, a ruler who governs below, a priest who mediates, a labouring population that maintains the order by feeding, building, carrying, counting, harvesting, and remembering. The more you study the ancient material, the less random it feels. You stand in thought on a high platform above a Mesopotamian city at dawn. Below you, courtyards wake in stages. Bakers tend ovens. A porter swings open a gate. Somewhere inside a temple enclosure, jars of oil and baskets of barley are being inventoried. The first smoke rises in thin lines. Light spreads over mud brick roofs and canal water. The city does not stir like wilderness. It stirs like a plain. That impression is not merely poetic. Historians and archaeologists have long recognized that Mesopotamian urban society was deeply structured. By the 3rd millennium BCE, city life involved formal administration, social ranks, institutional religion, labor obligations, long-distance trade, legal practices, and increasingly complex forms of kingship. Cylinder seals authenticated goods and identities. Accounting systems tracked production. Temples and palaces coordinated resources on a large scale. This was not accidental concentration. It was organized life. And once you notice how organized it is, the myths begin to sound different. Creation stories from Mesopotamia often move toward arrangement. Realms are divided. Tasks are assigned. Sacred centers are established. Human beings, when they appear in some traditions, are not placed at the center simply to admire existence. They are woven into a system of maintenance. The wording differs across texts and periods, and scholars remain careful about treating myth as a transparent statement of social reality. But the broad pattern is hard to miss. Cosmic order and civic order mirror one another. The universe is imagined as governed, distributed, and administered. That may simply reflect the societies that produce the myths. People living inside bureaucratic temple cultures would naturally imagine divine administration on a grand scale. That explanation is strong and widely accepted. But there is another way the pattern can feel when you sit with it long enough in the dark. It can feel reconstructed, as though later scribes and priests were preserving instructions from a world whose original builders had already receded from view. You begin, gently, to rebuild the broken machine from its remaining parts. One part is kingship. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship was never just practical leadership. It carried sacred sanction, ritual importance, and cosmic weight. Even in periods where political authority shifted between cities and dynasties, the institution itself was treated as fundamental. The ruler was caretaker, builder, military leader, judge, and intermediary under divine oversight. In inscriptions, kings frequently claimed that gods selected them, loved them, commanded them to build, or entrusted them with restoring order. Mainstream scholarship reads such language as political theology, and rightly so. Rulers justified power through divine association, yet the repetition of that formula across centuries produces an unusual effect. Power seems less invented than inherited. The office feels older than the office holder. The throne belongs first to the system, then to the man. Another part is sacred labour. Temple economies in ancient Mesopotamia were not symbolic ornaments. They were economic engines, land, livestock, workshops, textiles, grain stores, and dependent workers could all fall under institutional oversight. The gods, through their temples, were fed, clothed, housed, praised, and materially maintained by human effort. Of course, the statues themselves did not literally consume food in the modern sense, though offering structured real distributions and ritual life. Still, the arrangement is startling. Human labour rises upward through the system. Offerings, maintenance, and service keep the sacred order operational. A curious fringe reading has often taken this too literally, imagining ancient humanity as engineered servants for superior beings. Historians generally reject such blunt interpretations because they flatten myth into science fiction and ignore the ritual and literary complexity of the texts. But even once the exaggeration is removed, the underlying pattern remains worth noticing. The oldest surviving stories repeatedly place human beings inside a pre-existing order of service, whether that order is spiritual, political, symbolic, or some blend of all three. It is not primarily designed around human freedom, it is designed around stability. Another part of the machine is sacred geography. Cities are not merely settlements, they are appointed places. Uruk belongs to Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Eridu to Enki in later tradition. The city and the god define each other. Temples become earthly nodes in a cosmic map. Scholars have shown that Mesopotamian religion was deeply local, even when broader pantheons formed. Divine power was anchored in place. To belong to a city was to belong within a sacred arrangement of patronage, obligation, and ritual attention. A city without its divine centre would not feel complete. This too can be read in a straightforward way. Communities organise identity around shared cults and institutions. That is ordinary historical reasoning. Yet when you place sacred geography beside kingship, sacred labour, and mythic creation, something larger emerges. The system appears almost architectural. It has departments, territories, delegated powers, ranked responsibilities. It resembles an empire of meaning. Perhaps that is only because all durable societies create structure. It may be that you are imposing too much pattern on familiar ancient evidence. Scholars often warn against exactly that, and the warning is wise. Patterns can seduce. But in this case, the ancient record itself encourages the reconstruction. Lists of gods, lists of professions, lists of materials, lists of cities, rulers, offerings, omens, stars, birds, stones, diseases, and signs. Mesopotamian culture loved classification. It sorted the world into ordered categories with astonishing seriousness. This habit was intellectual, ritual, and administrative at once, and classification changes how a civilization experiences reality. To name is to fix. To list is to stabilize. To assign is to control. The world becomes legible through place in the system. Even omen literature, which might seem at first like wild divination, actually reflects enormous effort to correlate signs and outcomes. If this happens, that may follow. If the liver bears this mark, then that meaning belongs to it. If the sky behaves in this way, then that consequence might be expected. It is not chaos. It is an attempt to read the machine. You sit with that idea while evening gathers over the river plain. The wind carries the smell of rushes and kiln smoke. Somewhere cattle move in an enclosure. Somewhere a scribe presses one more sign into wet clay before the lamp fails. The ancient world no longer seems like a heap of disconnected myths. It seems like the remains of an operating order. And once you feel that, the central question sharpens: who built the order first? The cautious answer is simple. Human societies did, gradually, over long stretches of time, through adaptation, ritual, competition, memory, and power. That answer deserves respect because the archaeological evidence overwhelmingly supports human agency and the rise of cities and institutions. But perhaps the more unsettling version lies not in denying human agency, but in complicating inheritance. It is possible that each generation entered structures already old, explanations already sanctified, and classifications already carrying sacred force. The machine may have been rebuilt many times, with fewer and fewer people remembering its earliest design. Some have wondered whether this is why ancient myths so often describe decrees, assignments, and ordained stations rather than open invention. One reading of the text suggests not the birth of order, but its restoration after disruption. That reading cannot be confirmed in full. The record is too incomplete. The texts are layered and shaped by later copying. Yet it remains a compelling possibility that the oldest surviving systems are reconstructions of something older than the records themselves. The city below darkens by degrees. Fires become points of orange. Water becomes black glass. Above, the stars arrange themselves in cold patterns no human hand can change. Below, however, everything human seems arranged, measured, and assigned. And in that contrast you sense the strange dignity of the ancient world. It was not only trying to survive, it was trying to keep a design running. Even after the memory of its first engineers had grown uncertain, you do not appear at the centre of the story. That may be the strangest feeling of all. In so many modern tellings, humanity stands as the obvious focus, the expected destination, the creature for whom history has been patiently preparing a stage. But when you settle into the old Mesopotamian material, especially the creation traditions and temple logic that survived in clay, the mood is different. Human beings matter, certainly. They build the cities, feed the institutions, pray to the gods, raise families, fear floods, and bury their dead. Yet in many of the oldest surviving ideas, people seem less like the owners of the world than its maintenance staff. You feel that thought most sharply at dusk, standing in imagination near a temple courtyard where the day's final duties are being completed. A worker shoulders a basket. A woman pours grain from one jar to another. A priest washes before entering sacred space. Someone sweeps dust from a threshold, even though more dust will arrive tomorrow. The gestures are modest, repetitive, necessary. No one here seems to expect freedom from obligation. Life is rhythm, duty, and return. That practical atmosphere matches an important strand of Mesopotamian literature. In the Akkadian Atrahasis tradition, and in related later materials, humanity is created in part to relieve divine labour. The story is complex, shaped by mythic logic and literary structure, but the broad idea is plain enough. Human beings emerge as workers within a cosmic arrangement. Historians and philologists do not read this as biological science. Of course. They read it as myth-reflecting labour systems, divine kingship, and social imagination in the ancient Near East. Even so, the wording has a lasting chill. Humanity is not described first as sovereign, enlightened, or destined for self-expression. Humanity is useful. That usefulness appears in more than one form. You are there to cultivate, carry, pour, count, sing, repair, and remember. Not every text says this directly. A Mesopotamian thought was never a single unified doctrine. There were many cities, many eras, many theological emphases. Yet across the broad record, people often seem situated in relation to service, service to temple, service to city, service to ruler, service to divine order. A person's place is not imagined as self-generated, it is assigned, inherited, or recognized within structures already in motion. Mainstream scholarship has strong reasons for explaining this through history rather than mystery. Ancient Mesopotamian societies were highly stratified. Labour mattered. Irrigation required organization. Temples and palaces managed resources. It is only natural that myths from such a world would portray humanity as created for work and order. The stories mirror the social reality that produced them. That is the grounded answer, and it carries real explanatory weight. But at night, When the formal explanation has been acknowledged, the deeper unease remains. Why does the oldest remembered human role feel so administrative? Why do the stories speak as though our place had been determined before we arrived? You walk now beyond the city edge into harvested fields where cut stalks scratch your ankles, and the last light lies flat over the plain. A canal moves slowly nearby, carrying dark reflections of reeds and sky. Somewhere frogs speak from the banks. You look back at the temple silhouette and think about how early civilizations understood themselves. A farmer in this world did not wake thinking, "I will invent meaning today." Meaning was already distributed around him. The god had a shrine. The ruler had a seal. The field had a schedule. The calendar had festivals. The dead had obligations. Even the heavens had interpretive systems attached to them. To be human in such a world may have felt less like becoming and more like fitting. Perhaps that is all these old stories mean. Perhaps creation myths simply dramatize the psychological truth of traditional life. A child is born into duties older than memory, and naturally imagines that those duties descend from the gods. Scholars often point toward this kind of explanation, and it makes sense. But another possibility flickers in the margins. It is possible that the myths preserve a deeper cultural memory of humanity being altered, organized, or redirected by forces represented later as divine. Not forces in a modern technological sense, necessarily. Perhaps priestly elites, perhaps older civilizing groups, perhaps ancestral orders whose human faces disappeared over time and left only sacred titles behind. That suggestion cannot be proved, and it must remain a suggestion. The evidence is too indirect, yet it becomes intriguing when paired with the fragmentary character of the record. If human origins were remembered through layered retellings, then practical social transformations could, over centuries, harden into metaphysical creation. A population taught new rhythms of labour, new sacred obligations, new calendars, new forms of dependence, might later describe that transformation as being made for a purpose. Scholars remain divided even on the meanings of many individual passages. Translation itself introduces uncertainty. Sumerian, in particular, can be difficult and context-dependent. Terms for making, fashioning, appointing, or determining do not always map neatly onto modern categories. This matters because entire arguments about human purpose can hang on nuances of phrasing. Was humanity shaped as servant, substitute, steward, or participant? Does a line emphasize burden, care, ritual maintenance, or cosmic belonging? The tablets do not always answer cleanly, and perhaps that uncertainty is fitting, because even in your own life, purpose rarely arrives with perfect clarity. It is felt through repeated actions, through expectation, through structures you did not choose, through names for yourself that existed before you learned to speak. Ancient people may have experienced this at a civilizational scale. Their myths made visible what daily life already implied. You belong inside an inherited design. The smell of the fields changes as night settles. Dry straw gives way to damp earth. Someone in the distance is burning chaff, and the smoke drifts low and sweetly bitter. You think of the first cities, the first temples, the first archives, and wonder whether being human was once understood not as a privilege, but as an assignment. Some fringe traditions push this idea into darker territory, imagining humanity as engineered property or controlled stock. Such readings usually oversimplify the ancient texts and strip them of symbolism, poetry, and ritual depth. The mainstream evidence does not support such certainty. Still, the old literature does leave room for a quieter and more thoughtful discomfort. It may be that ancient people sensed a tension between human awareness and human obligation. They knew they could think, grieve, love, calculate, and dream. Yet they also lived inside systems that demanded service at every level. Myth allowed both truths to coexist. In that sense, the question of humanity's role becomes more reflective than dramatic. Were humans created to work, or did work become so central that creation was imagined through it? Were humans guided by gods, Or did priestly and royal systems grow so powerful that divine guidance seemed the only language large enough to describe them? Did ancient memory preserve literal makers, or only the feeling of having been shaped by hands no longer visible? It is possible that all three layers overlap: a real historical world of labour and hierarchy, a symbolic world of sacred narrative, a speculative world where forgotten transitions in human life were later remembered as acts of creation. You move back toward the city now. Lamps appear in doorways. A child laughs once and is hushed. Somewhere inside a house, bread is being torn and dipped. Somewhere else, a hymn is beginning in a voice trained to hold old words carefully. You realize then that the most unsettling feature of the ancient imagination is not that humans were made for a purpose. It is that the purpose may have been collective rather than personal.
Not who are you?
But what function do you serve? And if the first creators wanted humanity to remember anything at all, perhaps it was not its freedom, not its hidden power, not its secret destiny, but simply its place in the order. Everything else may have been allowed to fade. Night deepens, and the questions begin to lose their sharp edges. What seemed under daylight, like a structure to analyze, now feels more like something you're meant to sit beside quietly, the way you might sit beside a river without needing to measure its depth. The ancient world softens in darkness. The walls lose their hard lines. The fields become low silver shapes under moonlight. The temple steps hold pale dust. Reeds move with a sound like whispered cloth. Somewhere far off, a night bird calls once and falls silent again. You're no longer trying to solve the whole design. You're only listening for what remains. Perhaps that is the right mood for a subject like this. The earliest memories of humanity, if they survive at all, would not come down to us as a single clear statement. They would arrive in altered forms, a creation story told in a temple, a king list copied by a student, a flood narrative preserved because it still served ritual meaning, a divine title transferred from one language to another, a sacred role repeated long after its first explanation had been forgotten. This is not how certainty survives. It is how atmosphere survives. An atmosphere can tell you things that fact alone cannot. You sit now in imagination beside a canal where the water is almost black. The smell is cool and mineral, with a faint trace of marsh growth and distant smoke. The stars above the Mesopotamian plain are bright enough to seem close, but they do not answer anything. They simply endure. Beneath them, generations lived and died believing that the world had a pattern. Not always a comforting one, but a pattern nonetheless. Their labour fit into calendars, their cities fit into sacred maps, their rulers fit into divine hierarchies, their myths fit human life into arrangements too large to question casually. It may be that this is all memory ever was, not a literal report from the beginning, not a hidden archive waiting intact beneath the soil, but a set of repeated placements, teaching each generation where it stood in relation to the unseen. If so, then forgetting may not have happened once. It may have happened gradually, softly, almost kindly. A name becomes a title becomes a god. A historical rupture becomes a flood. A founder becomes a figure of heaven. A practical system becomes sacred law. No one chooses amnesia in a single day. It settles like silt in a river channel, layer by layer, until the older core still shapes the water, even after it can no longer be seen. That image feels especially right in southern Mesopotamia, where channels shifted and land remembered old water paths long after the surface changed. Archaeologists studying the region have shown again and again how environmental movement shaped settlement, agriculture, and continuity. Rivers wandered, marshes expanded and receded. Canals had to be cut, repaired, abandoned, and recut. Human order was always being maintained against drift. It is possible that memory behaved in much the same way. It had to be channeled. It had to be renewed. Left alone, it spread and thinned. Some have wondered whether ancient myths preserve precisely this tension between maintenance and loss. Not because the ancients knew secret facts modern people refuse to accept, but because they felt how easily foundations vanish. They lived among ruined walls. They rebuilt on old tells. They handled traditions older than their own language. A scribe copying a Sumerian composition in a later age was already working across distance. Even in antiquity, the beginning was becoming foreign. That simple fact changes the feeling of the myths. The people transmitting them were not standing at the source. They were inheritors, just as you are. Their certainty may have been liturgical rather than historical. They repeated what was necessary, what was holy, what held society together. But repetition is not the same as comprehension. It is possible to guard a structure faithfully, while no longer knowing why its first builders chose every part. Perhaps that is what happened with humanity's oldest story. Perhaps the first creators, if there were such remembered figures beneath the gods, were not erased in anger, but absorbed into more durable forms. It may be that names too specific, too local, or too strange were replaced with divine titles that later generations could understand. It is possible that rituals outlived explanations, and institutions outlived both. Scholars remain cautious about such possibilities because the evidence does not permit firm conclusions. The texts are fragmentary, archaeology is uneven, comparative mythology can illuminate patterns, but it can also tempt you into seeing unity where none exists. These cautions matter. They keep the night from turning feverish. But caution does not empty the mystery. It only slows it down. And in a story like this, slowness is not a weakness. It is the condition that lets faint things be heard. You think again of the human role in these old traditions. Service, care, maintenance, offering, labour. Not in every text, not in every mood, but often enough to leave a mark. Perhaps ancient societies simply projected their own structures onto the cosmos. That is the most grounded explanation. Yet perhaps there is another layer as well. It may be that the human experience of entering a ready-made order was so deep, so ancient, and so shared that it always felt older than politics. People may have sensed, long before writing, that they had been handed a world already partitioned into duties and meanings. If that is true, then memory itself may have been selective from the beginning. You do not need to imagine deliberate censorship. Human communities preserve what helps them live. They stabilize what protects continuity. They ritualize what keeps fear manageable. A story saying you were created to serve a sacred order may be easier to carry than a story saying no one fully remembers who assigned the order in the first place. Some have wondered whether the gods in ancient narrative are partly the final resting place of forgotten authorities. Not false, exactly, not masks in a simple sense. More like vessels into which older layers of memory settled over time. The moon has risen higher now, mud brick walls shine faintly at the corners, a dog curls beside a doorway. Somewhere reeds knock softly against a boat tied at the bank. You listen to the stillness and begin to feel that the past does not always want to be uncovered like treasure. Sometimes it wants only to be approached with patience. Perhaps the first creators were never meant to remain visible. It may be that their clearest traces survive not in names, but in arrangements, in the way kingship feels received, in the way temples feel like stations in a larger map, in the way humanity enters the story already obligated, in the way the earliest written civilizations look backward even while they are becoming new. None of this proves anything final. The record is too broken for that. Scholars remain divided on where myth ends, where memory begins, and whether the distinction is even useful in every case. But in the quiet, you begin to sense that the most important question may not be who the first creators were. It may be why their memory thinned into form rather than statement, why their presence, if it ever existed in human understanding, survived best as order, and why order can remain persuasive long after origin has gone dark. Some names arrive wearing impossible lengths of time. You encounter them not in open desert or broken temple courts, but in lists. Careful, formal, almost dry lists. That is part of what makes them so strange. If the ancient world wanted merely to enchant you, it could have hidden these figures in songs and visions alone. Instead, it places them inside records that imitate administrative order, a ruler, a city, a reign. Then another, and suddenly the numbers stretch beyond human sense. Thousands of years, tens of thousands. Time no longer feels biological. It feels ceremonial. You sit in imagination with a tablet containing one of the king traditions that has fascinated readers for generations. The signs are compact. The formula repeats. Kingship was in one city, then another. Rule moved, endured, transferred, before the flood. The reigns are immense. After the flood, they shrink. Though they remain large at first by ordinary standards. Scholars have long studied the Sumerian king list and related traditions not as straightforward chronicles, but as ideological texts, literary structures, and political instruments. The reign lengths almost certainly do not represent literal biographies in any modern sense. They may encode prestige, sacred antiquity, mathematical patterning, dynastic memory, or symbolic compression. That is the mainstream foundation, and it is an important one. Still, when you read the lines slowly at night, something deeper stirs. Why preserve impossibility in the form of a list at all? Why not simply say there was once a sacred age? Why bother naming cities, sequences, transfers of kingship, and rulers with assigned durations so far beyond ordinary life? The choice suggests that the ancient authors wanted more than mythic atmosphere. They wanted structured distance. They wanted the earliest age to feel organised, but unreachable. You imagine those first listed cities glowing faintly in the mind rather than on the ground. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lerak, Sippar, Shurupak. Some are known archaeologically, some more obscure in the material record, but in the literary imagination they become stations of first rule. Eridu in particular carries an ancient aura. Archaeology confirms it as one of the earliest important temple sites in southern Mesopotamia, associated later with the god Enki and with traditions of primordial wisdom. The site itself, excavated and studied, shows deep antiquity, mud brick platforms, temple rebuilding, layers of sacred continuity. Mainstream history does not need to turn Eridu into a supernatural capital to appreciate its importance. It was genuinely old, but genuine age can become sacred distance very easily. Perhaps that is what happened in the king traditions. Real centres of early significance were wrapped in literary antiquity until they became part of a remembered before time. Some scholars see the antediluvian kings as a way of distinguishing mythic time from historical time, a conceptual preface to the more believable dynastic record that follows. Others think the list helped later states create ideological unity by showing kingship as one continuous institution, descending through properly ordered stages. Both readings may be true at once. Yet another possibility, quieter and more speculative, lingers near the edges. It is possible that the impossibly long reigns are not intended to be read as simple duration at all, but as a way of signalling broken chronology. Some have wondered whether the great numbers preserve the residue of many remembered phases collapsed into singular royal names. Not one man ruling for millennia, but a throne name, a title, an office, or a composite memory holding an entire era within it. Historians cannot confirm this. The evidence is too ambiguous. But the very form of the king list encourages questions about how deep memory chooses to simplify itself. The flood stands there like a dividing wall in the middle of it all. Before it, the world is remote, ceremonially vast, crowded with rulers whose very scale resists realism. After it, things begin to feel more human, though still not entirely ordinary. This literary shift is one of the list's most fascinating features. It performs a narrowing of time. It makes the distant age feel qualitatively different from what comes later. Even if you read the entire structure symbolically, the effect remains powerful. The list teaches you how to feel about history. It says that there was once a time when rule itself belonged to another order of reality. That phrase matters, another order of reality. Not necessarily another planet, another species, or any modern imaginative shortcut. The ancient text does not ask for those things plainly. What it does offer is a hierarchy of ages. The earliest world is not just older. It is heavier with meaning, longer in measure, and farther from verification, in that sense. The list may preserve a human intuition common to many civilizations. The beginning is where proportion fails. The first rulers are too large because the first memory is too large. You walk now through the quiet remains of a city mound under starlight. Beneath your feet lie packed mud brick, ash, potsherds, seeds, bones, and forgotten floor plans. Archaeology can expose actual sequences of occupation, and those sequences are never as clean as king lists suggest. Cities rise, decline, overlap, transform. Power fragments, new groups enter. Old traditions persist beneath new language. The historical ground is complex. That complexity is one reason scholars treat literary order with caution. Texts simplify. Earth complicates. Still, it is precisely that tension between text and earth that gives the antediluvian kings their lasting power. The earth says layering. The text says lineage. The earth says uncertainty. The text says transfer. The earth says many lives forgotten. The text says kingship endured. Somewhere between those two forms of evidence, a deeper memory may be hiding. Not necessarily a secret kingdom of gods in the literal sense, but an ancient conviction that authority came from farther back than any city could fully account for. There are unusual fringe tidbits attached to these traditions. Of course, some modern readers have tried to compare the king list to occult chronologies, lost civilizations, or beings with unnaturally long lives. Such readings often ignore the literary conventions and ideological purposes of Mesopotamian texts, yet they remain popular for one reason. The ancient material itself invites the feeling that history once touched something outside ordinary scale. It makes rational readers cautious and imaginative readers restless. A more disciplined wonder is possible. Perhaps the first kings were remembered this way because kingship itself was older than any remembered dynasty. It may be that the institution felt inherited from a sacred past already beyond explanation. A ruler sitting on a throne in a later city was not the inventor of the office. He was occupying a seat that seemed to have descended through uncounted time. That feeling, once ritualized, would naturally stretch the earliest reigns into symbolic vastness. Some scholars suggest that ancient numerology and literary convention explain much of this, and they likely do. But literary convention is never empty. It chooses its symbols for a reason. The wind moves across the mound. Dry grasses whisper in patches where walls no longer stand. Somewhere below the surface, tablets still sleep in rooms that have not yet been opened. You look at the stars and understand that the kings before the flood are not frustrating because they are unbelievable. They are frustrating because they are believable in the wrong way, not as literal chronicle, but as evidence that ancient people inherited an idea of first rule so distant, so sanctified, and so difficult to humanize that only impossible numbers could contain it. Maybe that is how memory protects what it cannot explain. It magnifies it. It places it before the flood. It assigns it to kings whose names survive while their meaning grows dim. And it leaves you standing centuries later with a tablet in your hands, wondering whether the earliest rulers of humanity were forgotten as individuals, remembered as symbols, or never meant to be remembered clearly at all. The first city is never entirely first. That realization comes quietly when you look down instead of outward. Not at the skyline, not at the temples, not at the names preserved in literature, but at the ground itself. Ancient Mesopotamian cities did not rise on untouched earth. They accumulated. One structure settled, cracked, and was filled in. Another was built above it. Courtyards were repaved. Walls were thickened. Platforms were raised. Temples were rebuilt on old footprints because sacred place had gravity. And gravity in the ancient world often meant returning to where something had already stood. You walk in imagination through a temple precinct at dawn before the crowds have stirred. The air is still cool. Dust clings to your sandals. A low wall catches the first light. What seems, from a distance, like a single complex is in truth a layered hill of decisions made across centuries. Beneath the newest floor lies an older one. Beneath that, another. Beneath the painted plaster and repaired bricks, older hands remain hidden. The city presents itself as present tense, but its weight comes from burial. This is one of the most grounded truths archaeology offers. Settlement mounds, or tells, form because human beings keep returning to favoured locations. In Mesopotamia, this process could become especially dramatic. Mud brick architecture decays, collapses, and is rebuilt. Flooding, levelling, and reconstruction create stacked occupational layers. Excavators working at sites such as Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and many others do not uncover a single city. They uncover many cities folded into one place, even when a settlement seems continuous. What continuity means can vary. Ritual continuity, political continuity, architectural continuity, sometimes all three, sometimes only one. That makes foundations strangely emotional, because a foundation is never just engineering. It is memory made load-bearing. Ancient rulers understood this well. Mesopotamian inscriptions often celebrate the restoration of old temples, the finding of ancient foundation deposits, or the respectful rebuilding of sanctuaries according to earlier plans. Kings sought legitimacy by linking themselves to deeper lines of sacred place. To rebuild was to claim continuity with a world that already carried divine approval. This is historical fact, not speculative fancy. Royal texts repeatedly frame renovation as a pious act of return. But what exactly were they returning to? A particular temple plan? Perhaps. A remembered cultic sequence? An ancestral location sanctified by long use? All of these are likely. Yet in the half-darkness of this subject, another thought appears. It is possible that later builders, even when acting sincerely, did not fully understand the oldest meanings of the places they preserved. A sanctuary may remain sacred long after the first reason for its sacredness has faded. A city may honour an ancient mound simply because generation after generation has inherited the habit of honour. The foundation survives. The explanation thins. You think of Eridu again, often treated in tradition as one of the oldest cities and associated with the deep wisdom of Enki. Archaeology confirms the site's very early religious importance, with successive temple levels reaching far back into prehistoric Mesopotamia. Yet no one standing in a late temple there would have perceived its deepest origins directly. They would have inherited a sacred centre, already old beyond ordinary comprehension. The ground beneath the shrine would have been dense with forgotten acts. This pattern appears elsewhere too. In city after city, older occupation underlies later complexity. The people who built monumental centres often lived atop much smaller, earlier communities. Before urban administration became visible in writing, there had already been habitations, shrines, craft areas, exchange networks, and local customs. Before the first-named dynasties, there were people making daily life possible. Before the city could explain itself, the place already had a history. Perhaps that should not surprise you. Human settlement always grows from previous choices. Yet the emotional effect in Mesopotamia is distinctive, because the literature of the later cities often speaks as though sacred order arrived already formed. The texts emphasize appointed places, divine patronage, and inherited authority. Archaeology, meanwhile, reveals deep material layering. Between those two perspectives lies an unsettling possibility. The cities of written memory may have formalized and sacralized locations whose significance began in ages no longer clearly understood. Some fringe interpretations take this much further, suggesting that early temple sites were built over lost technical installations, forgotten observatories, or traces of vanished civilizers. Most such claims outrun the evidence and ignore the very human processes visible in excavation: mud brick, pottery, burials, domestic refuse, gradual development. The archaeological record overwhelmingly speaks of human communities adapting over long spans of time. Still, the fringe imagination is responding to a real sensation created by the evidence. The oldest sacred places often feel inherited from a depth that later cultures can honour better than explain. Scholars debate many parts of this picture. Continuity of sacred use is not always straightforward. A later temple built atop an earlier structure does not automatically mean the later community understood itself as preserving the same theology. Meanings shift. Gods merge or absorb local forms. Political power rebrands old sanctity. Even architectural continuity can be strategic rather than organic. The uncertainty matters because it keeps the buried layers open to more than one reading. You crouch now beside an imagined excavation trench. The cut exposes alternating bands of packed earth, ash, brick fall, reed impressions, and plaster fragments. A specialist might identify phases by ceramics, bricks, radiocarbon samples where available, or associated artifacts. To you, in this quiet narrative moment, the trench looks like a cross-section of forgetting. Each level was once a lived present, each thought itself whole, then it sank into support for the next. There is a tenderness in that. A household becomes fill for a shrine becomes platform for a larger temple. A lane becomes buried beneath a courtyard. A wall line survives only because a later builder found it useful enough not to destroy completely. History does not always erase by violence. Often it preserves by burying, and buried preservation changes the way memory works. A later generation may stand on the highest platform and believe it has reached the center of sacred truth, while under its feet lie earlier arrangements that shaped everything but are no longer visible. It may be that humanity's oldest ideas about creators, rulers, and ordered purpose followed a similar path. New names rose above old names. Theological meanings covered practical memories. Divine narrative settled over older social transformations. What remained accessible was the surface form, not the deepest layer. One reading of the Mesopotamian record implies exactly this kind of inherited reconstruction. The first cities we can name may not have invented sacred order so much as concentrated and formalized older local traditions, whose original context stretched beyond writing. If that is right, then urban civilization in Sumer was less a sudden birth than a remembering machine built over forgotten ground. It did not create humanity's first creators. It translated them into temple language. That thought cannot be proven cleanly. Too much is lost. Too much depends on inference. Archaeology gives you layers, not full explanations. Texts give you explanations, but only from later heights. Scholars remain careful, because evidence from one domain does not automatically resolve the other. Yet when you place trench and tablet beside each other, the feeling grows stronger. Human memory becomes most formal at the very moment it becomes most distant from its own foundations. Evening settles over the city mound now. The exposed trench cools. Wind carries the smell of dry grass and worked clay. Somewhere nearby, someone seals a foundation deposit into a new wall, leaving an inscription for future builders who may one day uncover it. That imagined gesture contains the whole theme of the night. People build forward, but they ask legitimacy from what lies below. And the deeper the foundation, the less clearly it can speak. Perhaps that is why the oldest cities always seem to glance downward in their myths. They know, in some buried way, that their holiest places were old before they learned to write about them. They know that the first sacred ground may have been chosen for reasons no later priest could fully explain. They know that beginnings do not vanish. They harden beneath the floors, and they continue carrying the world long after their names have been covered over. By the time the lamps are lit, the city has become a system of offerings. You can feel it in the measured movement of people through gateways and courtyards, in the jars being carried, in the bread being baked, in the animals tethered for temple use, in the scribes marking quantities while shadows lengthen on the walls. Nothing here is random. Every act seems to belong somewhere. A basket of barley is not only food. A woven cloth is not only cloth. Oil, incense, beer, dates, wool, fish, and labour all move through channels that connect household, field, workshop, shrine, and storehouse. It is a practical economy, yes, but also a sacred current. And at the centre of that current stands a troubling thought. What if the makers and their servants were never entirely separate categories? Ancient Mesopotamian religion is full of hierarchy. Gods command, kings obey and transmit command. Priests maintain rituals. Workers sustain institutions. Households sustain workers. It is an old chain, and the surviving texts leave little doubt that social and cosmic order were deeply intertwined. In temple economies of the 3rd millennium BCE, especially in Sumerian city-states, Institutions could control land, labour, livestock, workshops, and redistribution. This is grounded history. Administrative tablets revealed rations, personnel, outputs, and duties with striking precision. The sacred centre was also an economic centre, yet the language used to describe these relationships often feels more intimate, even more domestic than modern readers expect. The gods are housed, clothed, washed, fed, entertained, praised, carried in procession. Their statues do not merely symbolize presence in a vague way. In ritual life, they are treated as living focal points of divine identity. Temples become households at cosmic scale. The deity is lord, patron, owner, and recipient. Humanity serves, but service takes many forms. Not every servant is lowly, not every act is humiliation. Some service is dignity, craft, precision, beauty, and maintenance of the world. That complexity matters. It keeps you from flattening the old material into a simple story of oppression from above. Mesopotamian civilization was hierarchical, certainly, but also deeply invested in care. Offerings had to be pure. Ritual timing mattered. Textiles could be exquisite. Hymns could be beautifully composed. Skilled labour was honoured even when subordinated. A temple singer, a brewer, a weaver, a metal worker, and a scribe all participated in sustaining the sacred machine. In that sense, servants were not outside meaning. They were inside it. Still, the underlying arrangement remains striking. The makers, although you're remembered as makers, occupy a radically different level of authority from those who sustain the order below. Divine beings in myth establish cities, decree destinies, assign offices, and determine fates. Humans inherit the field of action that remains. That contrast has invited many readings. Historians usually understand it through ancient political theology and social structure. People imagine the cosmos in forms familiar from palace and temple life. The world had rulers because society had rulers. That explanation is sound and necessary. But perhaps there is another layer beneath it. Perhaps the distinction between makers and servants is so strong because it preserves the memory of an actual transition, not necessarily from gods to humans in a literal biological sense, but from one order of organizing intelligence to another. Some have wondered whether creation myths encode moments when human communities were gathered, disciplined, and integrated into systems they did not originate. A people taught irrigation schedules, temple obligations, specialized labor, and sacred calendars might later remember that transformation not as gradual social development, but as being placed into service by higher powers. This idea must remain cautious. There is no tablet that says plainly. Here is the historical process by which unknown founders reorganized humanity and were later remembered as gods. The record does not hand you that conclusion, but neither does it completely erase the possibility that divine narratives contain cultural memory of social engineering so old it could only be preserved in sacred form. You move now through a workshop attached to the temple precinct. The smell of heated clay mingles with wool dust and oil. A potter turns a vessel slowly, while another worker trims leather nearby. A woman counts finished textiles. In one corner, a scribe notes quantities on a damp tablet. This is accepted archaeology brought to life in imagination. Mesopotamian institutions depended on specialized production. Standardization, accounting, and labor management were real features of urban life. The servant class, if that phrase can even hold the diversity involved, was not a single group but a web of dependencies. And that web raises a subtler question. If humanity's role was service, service to whom exactly? To gods as transcendent beings? To temple institutions staffed by elites? To the maintenance of social order itself? To memory? The answer may be all of these at once. Ancient categories do not separate neatly the way modern ones do. A person delivering grain to a temple was participating in economics, religion, politics, and cosmology simultaneously. The god received. The institution recorded. The city stabilized, the ruler gained legitimacy, the worker reaffirmed place. This fusion is one of Mesopotamia's most important realities, and it makes the old stories powerful. When myths say humans were made for labor, they are not talking about labor in an abstract mechanical way. They are talking about labor as the thread binding cosmos and city. There is an unusual fringe tidbit that sometimes appears around these texts, the suggestion that offerings to the gods resemble tribute paid to absent overlords. In its cruder form, the idea is unhelpful and reductionist, but in a softened form, it points towards something interesting. Ancient religion often behaves as though the visible world owes upkeep to invisible authority. That does not prove literal overlords. It does reveal a worldview in which the highest powers expect maintenance. The makers do not vanish after creation. They remain recipients. Scholars debate how best to interpret this intimacy between divine and institutional economy. Some emphasize genuine devotion and ritual ontology. Others stress political control and resource concentration. Still, others point out that ordinary people likely experience these systems differently depending on class, city, and era. A weaver attached to a temple, a rural farmer paying obligations, and a palace official would not all feel service the same way. This uncertainty is important because it prevents you from imagining one single human experience. Even so, the broad structure remains visible in the half-light. Above, powers that assign. Below, communities that sustain. You sit near the temple threshold now as the night air begins to cool the bricks. Incense lingers. Somewhere within the precinct, a hymn is being recited with careful repetition. The words may be ancient even to the singer. That detail matters more than it first seems. Service is not only physical, it is verbal. Ritual language itself becomes maintenance. To praise correctly is to keep the structure aligned. To forget a formula may feel like letting something slip. Perhaps that is why memory and servitude cling so closely together in these traditions. To serve is to repeat is to preserve, and to preserve is to keep alive a design whose original purpose may no longer be fully understood. It may be that humanity's deepest role in the oldest stories was not merely to work for the makers, but to carry forward the maker's world after direct memory had faded. Some have wondered whether this is why so much of ancient religion revolves around restoration, reenactment, and ritual exactness. The servant does not create ex nihilo. The servant keeps the pattern from collapsing. That thought softens the hierarchy without erasing it. It suggests that humans, though subordinate in mythic terms, also inherit tremendous responsibility. Not ownership, perhaps, but custody. The city survives because people continue the forms. The temple stands because hands return each day. The gods remain present because songs are repeated and offerings renewed. The makers may be above, distant, or half forgotten, but their order endures only through the servants below. By the time the last lamp flickers in the courtyard, the city no longer feels like a simple arrangement of domination. It feels like a relay. The makers establish, the servants continue, and somewhere across generations, continuation becomes the only memory most people are ever allowed to hold. After destruction, the world rarely begins again all at once. It begins in patched walls, in renamed gods, in salvage stories, in people who continue old motions without fully trusting that the old protections still hold. You can feel that mood tonight in the hush after imagined catastrophe, when the air seems washed clean but uncertain, and the city that survives looks less like a triumph than a careful reconstruction. Somewhere mud has dried where floodwater once stood. Somewhere timbers have been replaced. Somewhere a priest has memorized a hymn whose original setting no longer exists. This, too, belongs to the ancient Near East. Cities fell, rivers shifted, dynasties ended, invasions came, trade routes changed, salinization weakened fields in some regions, political centers moved, temples burned or were abandoned and later restored. The archaeological and textual record of Mesopotamia is not one rising line of progress. It is a repeated pattern of build, damage, adaptation, and return. This is grounded history. The plain between the rivers rewarded settlement, but it never promised permanence. That repeated vulnerability changes how you hear the old stories. Flood tales, city laments, royal rebuilding inscriptions, and myths of divine displeasure all circle one shared fear. Order can be broken, the gods can withdraw favour, the city can become ruin. In Sumerian lamentations over destroyed cities, the emotional force is extraordinary, or the land is emptied, the people scatter, the sanctuary is abandoned, dust replaces music. These texts are poetic and theological, but they also reflect the real experience of collapse. A civilization that has seen its centres fall does not imagine time the same way as one that thinks itself secure. You walk now through an imagined quarter of a city after floodwater has receded. Reed matting is stuck against a doorway. The smell is sharp with wet clay, rot, and smoke from damp fuel. A broken jar lies half buried in silt. 2 men clear debris from a threshold while someone else drags damaged baskets into the sun. No one speaks much. The motions are slow and necessary. Reconstruction begins before explanation does. Perhaps that is why flood stories loom so large. They do not just describe disaster. They make disaster meaningful by giving it sequence: before, judgment or disturbance, survival, renewal. Such structures are common across cultures because they transform chaos into narrative. Historians studying Mesopotamian flood traditions generally point to a combination of literary transmission, local flood experience, and theological imagination. There is no single flood layer in archaeology that neatly matches every later story, and scholars are careful about making one-to-one identifications. Still, the environment made catastrophic flooding believable, and memory gave it mythic shape. What interests you tonight is not whether one specific flood happened exactly as later stories say. It is the possibility that each great ruin rewrote memory. When a city collapses, what gets carried forward? Not everything. Survivors preserve what can be recited, what can be rebuilt, what can be justified. Ritual forms may return before old meanings do. Political systems may claim continuity they do not fully possess. A restored temple may stand on the same platform while serving a changed society. In that sense, every reconstruction is also an edit. Some have wondered whether this is how humanity lost sight of its earliest creators, if such memories ever existed in concrete form. Not by a single deliberate erasure, but by repeated historical resets. A flood here, a conquest there, a migration, a language shift, a temple restored under new authority, a tradition recopied in altered terms. Over centuries, the original figures behind sacred order could blur into divine categories broad enough to survive disruption. Historians cannot verify such a sequence in detail, but the mechanism itself is deeply human. Ruin reduces memory to what can be carried. You pass now into a rebuilt sanctuary. The walls are newer than the foundation. The paint is fresh, but the plane is old. Inscriptions from Mesopotamian kings often celebrate exactly this kind of act. A ruler discovers ancient foundation deposits, consults old inscriptions, and rebuilds the temple as it was before. This is not merely vanity. It reflects a real concern for continuity through rupture. To rebuild wrongly would risk disorder. To rebuild rightly was to restore relation between city and cosmos. And yet no rebuilding is pure return. A later king reads the past through his own needs. He may restore a sanctuary, but he also places his name into its history. He becomes part of the foundation story. This is one of the oldest habits of power. Restoration legitimizes itself by claiming fidelity. The result is never false exactly, but layered. The city is old. The city is new. The ruin is remembered. The ruin is also covered over. That layering becomes even more interesting when you think about mythic time. A flood divides the ages. A dynasty restarts order. A surviving hero receives knowledge and passes it on. These are not just dramatic episodes. They are narrative technologies for handling cultural discontinuity. If something once existed before the remembered order, repeated catastrophe would be an excellent way for it to become inaccessible. Fragments survive, but only in softened symbolic form. There is a curious fringe habit of reading every ancient ruin as evidence of a lost advanced civilization erased by sudden cataclysm. Most scholars reject this because the archaeological record usually shows continuity, adaptation, and regionally specific causes rather than one global vanished superculture. But the fringe instinct is not responding to nothing. It is responding to a genuine pattern in human memory. Civilizations regularly experience rupture and then explain themselves through stories of surviving wisdom, sacred restoration, and diminished inheritance. The surviving world often feels lesser than the lost one. Perhaps ancient Mesopotamia felt that too. Perhaps each rebuilding deepened the sense that the earliest order had been stronger, clearer, closer to the gods. It may be that the repeated need to restore temples and cities encouraged the belief that original foundations were purer than current life. Some scholars see exactly this dynamic in royal inscriptions and religious conservatism. Origins gain prestige because the present feels damaged. That is historical enough, but it also opens the door to a more reflective possibility. Humanity may remember its creators poorly, not because memory failed once, but because the world kept breaking around the memories until only formal patterns remained. Night has settled fully now. Repaired walls cast long, dark angles. Water left in the low places reflects a thin moon. A woman wrings cloth at a basin. Nearby, someone recites an old line over a newly cleaned threshold. The line may have been spoken for generations. The threshold was remade today. That is how continuity often works. Ancient words passing over altered matter. Scholarly uncertainty remains everywhere here. Not every destruction was total. Not every restoration implied deep rupture. Many institutions were surprisingly resilient. Local traditions could endure for centuries beneath political change. At the same time, many gaps in the record are real and irreparable. Archives vanish. Sites remain buried. Languages shift. The stories that survive are those copied often enough to outlive disaster. That alone should make you cautious about assuming that the preserved version was ever the whole story. Perhaps the world after ruin is always smaller than the world before it. Smaller in memory, smaller in language, smaller in what it can safely explain. If so, then the ancient stories about first order, sacred rule, and assigned human purpose may be post-ruin memories, not original declarations. They may be the carefully carried pieces of a larger pattern no longer fully visible. The first creators, if they had once been known in clearer terms, would by then have been reduced to roles, titles, and mythic functions broad enough to survive the next flood, the next collapse, the next rewriting. The city sleeps around you now, restored for the moment. But the silence says something the inscriptions do not. Every order you can see has already been broken at least once, and every restoration, however faithful, changes what future generations will remember as the beginning. Sometimes memory does not vanish. It changes its name. You notice this most when the same divine function seems to move from one language into another, from one city into another, from one age into another, while keeping just enough of its shape to remain familiar. The older Sumerian world gives way, gradually and unevenly, to Akkadian speech and later imperial forms. Deities are translated, merged, elevated, localized, reinterpreted. A god of one city becomes identified with a broader figure. An old title becomes part of a new theological system. A sacred personality survives, but not unchanged. What remains is continuity through transformation. This is one of the most important and most grounded realities of Mesopotamian religion. The ancient Near East was never static. Sumerian and Akkadian cultures interacted deeply. Later Babylonian and Assyrian traditions inherited, adapted, and reworked earlier myths, hymns, rituals, and divine identities, Inanna and Ishtar, Enki and Ea, Utu and Shamash. The names shift with language and political context, yet a recognizable thread continues. Historians and philologists have studied these developments closely, not as evidence of confusion, but as evidence of living tradition. Religion survived by translating itself, and translation is never neutral. A translated name carries the old function into a new world, but it also adjusts meaning to fit new needs. The god becomes legible again, though perhaps with altered emphasis. A local patron may become imperial. A figure of craft or wisdom may gather additional cosmic traits. A goddess once rooted in one city's life may take on broader associations with kingship, love, war, or celestial power. The continuity is real. So is the change. You sit in imagination in a scribal chamber where tablets in different languages share the same wooden shelf. One text preserves a Sumerian hymn copied centuries after spoken. Sumerian had ceased to be an everyday language. Another offers an Akkadian version of older material, reshaped for later readers. Lamps hiss faintly. The clay smells warm. A scribe copies signs he has learned through schooling, not family memory. Already the act is one of preservation through distance. That distance matters more than it first seems. A tradition that must be studied as a learned language has crossed a threshold. It has become heritage, Sumerian, in many later contexts, survived as a scholarly and liturgical language much as Latin would much later survive in other civilizations. This is accepted history, but heritage languages behave in a revealing way. They preserve formula better than living context. They allow old words to survive long after the world that gave them their first texture has disappeared. In such a setting, names endure, but their emotional weight changes. Perhaps that is how the first creators, if there were once more specific memories beneath the gods, slipped beyond recognition. It may be that they were not erased, but translated upward into safer and broader identities. A remembered founder becomes associated with a god. A god becomes identified with another god in another language. A local mystery becomes part of a universal pantheon. At each stage something survives, but not everything. Scholars remain careful here because the evidence supports cultural adaptation more directly than hidden creators. Still, the mechanism is suggestive. Identity can be preserved and concealed by the same process. You move now through a temple library at dusk while a recitation begins nearby. The voice uses names that would have sounded ancient even to some of the listeners. The older names carry prestige. They are signs of authenticity, sacred age, and learned authority. Yet no one in the room hears them exactly as their earlier speakers did. Layers of interpretation stand in between. The divine title is old. The world hearing it is not. This is where the emotional tension of the ancient record becomes especially strong. We modern readers often treat variant names as a helpful glossary. Sumerian here, Akkadian there, later equivalent over here. But for the people who lived inside these transitions, the shifts were part of their world being rewritten. Political power moved, languages interacted, gods travelled, merged, and expanded. The sacred order remained, but its vocabulary changed. That may have made continuity feel natural, yet also created perfect conditions for older memories to dissolve into theology. There is a curious mainstream example of how deeply this process can matter. The flood hero known in one tradition under one name can appear in another, under a related but distinct identity. Narrative structure remains, while details, emphasis, and theological frames evolve. Scholars use such parallels to map literary transmission and cultural contact. But beyond literary history, the pattern suggests something broader. Ancient civilizations often preserved what mattered most by renaming it in forms their current age could carry. A more speculative reading asks whether the same process could apply not only to flood survivors or city gods, but to humanity's earliest remembered authorities. Some have wondered whether beings once imagined as ancestral founders, lawgivers, or civilizers were gradually elevated, absorbed, or universalized until their original status became unreachable. Historians cannot demonstrate that with certainty, and there is a risk of overreading theological adaptation as hidden biography. Yet the basic principle is sound. Names change, functions persist, memory survives in altered costume, scholarly uncertainty remains everywhere. Syncretism is not always neat. Sometimes two gods are equated without being fully identical. Sometimes one city resists a broader imperial interpretation. Sometimes literary texts preserve older distinctions that ritual practice blurs. Even translation can hide debate rather than resolve it. A scribe choosing one divine equivalence over another may be preserving a theological argument, not a settled consensus. The ancient world was full of negotiation disguised as continuity. You feel that negotiation in the air tonight. The temple walls hold incense and old smoke. A bronze fitting cools on a wooden door. Somewhere deeper inside, a priest speaks the name of a god with formal precision, and in that single name are centuries of merging, shifting, and revoicing. The word sounds fixed. The history behind it is fluid. Perhaps human memory always works this way. A family name shifts in pronunciation. A local saint absorbs an older custom. A mountain spirit becomes a god. A god becomes a title for order itself. By the time the process is complete, what survives is not a lie, but a surface. The old depth remains beneath it, supporting meaning without being fully visible. In Mesopotamia, where cities rose and fell and languages intertwined, such transformations were not exceptional. They were the normal price of continuity. A tradition that refused to change would break. A tradition that changed too freely would lose authority. Survival required a careful balance. Preserve the sacred shape, adapt the sacred name. It may be that the memory of humanity's first creators, if it ever existed in sharper form, face the same demand. Too specific, and it might die with a city. Too local, and it might vanish with a dialect. Too strange, and later priesthoods might not know how to carry it. But transformed into divine office, sacred title, cosmic function, or mythic ancestor, it could endure for millennia. Not clearly, not literally, but enduring all the same. The moonlight touches the upper edge of the wall now. The recitation ends. A scribe covers damp tablets with cloth. Outside, the city breathes in slower rhythms. You realize then that changing names don't always mark forgetting. Sometimes they mark the opposite. Sometimes a culture cares so deeply about preserving what came before that it changes the form just enough to keep the substance alive. And somewhere in that long chain of reverent substitutions, the first makers may have ceased to be remembered as persons at all. They may have become titles, then gods, then silence wrapped inside names too sacred to question. Knowledge in the ancient world is rarely free. It is guarded, measured, granted in portions, and often described as dangerous when held by the wrong hands or at the wrong time. You feel this almost immediately when you move from the broad themes of kingship and creation into the older stories of wisdom, craft, destiny, and divine decree. The world of Mesopotamia does not imagine understanding as a casual possession. Knowledge belongs first to the gods, then to kings, priests, diviners, scribes, and specialists who receive access under conditions. Ordinary life depends on knowledge, of course, but sacred and cosmic knowledge sits behind thresholds. You stand in imagination at the doorway of a room where omen tablets are stored. The air is dry and smells faintly of clay dust, oil, and old reed baskets. Inside, shelves hold ordered texts on divination, rituals, incantations, lexical lists, and learned traditions. A lamp burns with controlled steadiness. This is not a room of random curiosity. It is a room of managed insight. To know is to be initiated into forms, sequences, and permissions. Every line has a place. Every sign is part of a chain. That is grounded history. Mesopotamian scholarship was highly structured. Diviners, exorcists, scribes, and temple scholars cultivated bodies of knowledge that required long training. Omen series, ritual texts, and lexical lists were not common village memory. They were specialist tools. Even writing itself, though powerful, was not universal. Literacy was concentrated. Access to stored knowledge depended on institutions. This is one reason the ancient world often feels like a civilization of guarded thresholds. What matters most is not simply known, it is administered. And once you notice that, the old myths begin to vibrate differently. Perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian figure connected with deep wisdom is Enki, later identified with Ea, a deity associated with fresh water, skill, cunning, creation, and hidden understanding. In mythic tradition, such wisdom is often ambivalent. It saves, advises, and shapes, but it also remains selective. Knowledge is not scattered like rain. It is contained in decrees, arts, powers, plans, and destinies. The Sumerian concept of the me, though difficult to translate perfectly, is often understood as involving divine ordinances or foundational powers linked to civilization and social order. These are not simple objects. They are the authorized principles that make cultural life possible. That idea is quietly astonishing. Civilization itself is imagined as a set of controlled endowments: kingship, crafts, ritual offices, sexual order, music, truth, perhaps even deception and lamentation. All can appear within a framework of distributed powers belonging first to the divine realm. Scholars debate the exact interpretation of the me and caution against making them too rigidly systematic by modern standards. Still, the central feeling remains clear. Human society is not imagined as inventing its most basic structures from nothing. It receives them, and received gifts are always double-edged. A gift can civilize, a gift can bind, a gift can elevate, a gift can limit the imagination by defining its permitted forms. It may be that ancient people sensed this deeply. To inherit language, law, ritual, calendar, and kingship is to inherit possibility, but also boundary. You do not begin open, you begin inside arrangement. Some have wondered whether this is why stories of wisdom acquisition in the ancient world so often carry tension. The gaining of knowledge can involve theft, cunning, divine favour, peril, or selective transmission. It is not presented as automatic human entitlement. Even where a myth is playful or symbolic, the structure remains. Valuable awareness belongs somewhere before it belongs to you. Historians read such stories in relation to temple culture, scribal elites, and the politics of sacred knowledge. That reading is persuasive. Institutions that depend on specialized expertise naturally imagine wisdom as controlled, yet perhaps there is another layer beneath the institutional one. It is possible that the old stories preserve an even older unease about human consciousness itself. Not merely that humans work, serve, and maintain, but that humans know enough to ask why. That is a different kind of problem. A labouring species that begins to reflect on its place may become unstable. It may seek forbidden explanations. It may challenge inherited roles. If there were ever ancient memories of creators, lawgivers, or civilizers shaping humanity for order, then the growth of human self-awareness would be the one development most likely to generate anxiety. This remains speculative, and it should remain so. The Mesopotamian texts do not announce a rebellion of consciousness in modern terms, but they do reveal a world in which access to deeper understanding is mediated, stratified, and ritually controlled. The gods know the full design. Humans glimpse portions. Kings may be chosen to receive dream messages. Priests and diviners interpret signs. Scribes preserve difficult languages. The pattern suggests not ignorance exactly, but managed awareness. You walk now into open night where the city roofs lie under starlight, and the air has cooled enough to smell of dust, water, and distant date palms. Above you the sky is thick with constellations the Mesopotamians watched with extraordinary seriousness. Astronomy and astrology in the ancient Near East developed through careful observation, recording, and interpretation. This was not random superstition. It was disciplined attention to pattern. Yet even here, in the study of the heavens, knowledge was not simply for everyone. Celestial signs had political, ritual, and divinatory significance. The sky was read by specialists for consequences below. Awareness, then, it was always tied to responsibility. To know a sign was to know what action it required. To interpret a portent was to decide what must be averted, purified, delayed, or accepted. This makes ancient knowledge feel heavy rather than liberating. Perhaps that is the forbidden quality hiding inside it. Not a childish prohibition against curiosity, but the sober recognition that some truths rearrange obligation. Once you know the pattern, you must serve it differently. There is an unusual fringe tidbit often attached to ancient wisdom traditions. The suggestion that early civilizations remembered a lost body of superior knowledge once granted by non-human teachers and later restricted. Most scholars would reject the literal form of that claim, but in softer language, something like it may still be useful. Ancient myths repeatedly imagined civilization as bestowed, not self-generated, and wisdom as something humans receive in partial measure. That does not prove external teachers in any sensational sense. It does suggest that the first remembered structure of human awareness was dependent and incomplete. Scholars remain divided on many details. How should the me be understood in full? How much continuity exists between early Sumerian ideas and later Akkadian reinterpretations? To what extent do stories of cunning acquisition reflect ritual politics versus broader anthropology of culture? The answers are not simple. Texts are fragmentary. Terms carry layered meaning. Different cities and periods emphasize different aspects of divine wisdom. Uncertainty lives inside the archive. But the atmosphere of the archive is unmistakable. Knowledge is precious. Knowledge is ranked. Knowledge changes what kind of human being you are allowed to become. The city has grown very still now. Somewhere behind a wall, a scholar murmurs through a line twice before pressing it into memory. Somewhere else, a mother tells a child a simplified story whose deeper meaning belongs to the temple and the tablet house. Between those two acts lies the whole mystery of human awareness. What is told to everyone, and what is withheld? What becomes folklore, and what remains sacred technique? What is remembered as gift, and what is feared as burden? Perhaps humanity was never meant to remember its first creators clearly because clear memory would have changed the terms of human life. It may be that awareness was always meant to remain partial, enough to work within the pattern, enough to preserve it, enough to wonder in whispers, but not enough to stand fully outside it and name the makers without mediation. If so, then the first forbidden gift was not fire or writing or kingship. It was the slow awakening of the question itself. Who ordered this world for us? And why were we only allowed to inherit fragments of the answer? The men who remembered most may also have been the ones who changed the story most carefully, not out of cruelty, not necessarily out of deception, but because memory in the ancient world was never passive storage. It was active handling, selection, arrangement, recitation, correction, adaptation. You feel this tonight when you step into the imagined stillness of a temple archive after midnight, when the city outside has quieted and only a few lamps remain burning. A priest bends over a tablet. A scribe waits with damp clay ready. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a hymn has just ended, and the last note seems to cling faintly to the brick. This is the world of the keepers. Ancient Mesopotamia depended not only on kings and workers, but on learned specialists who preserved divine names, ritual formulas, omen sequences, liturgies, lamentations, lexical lists, and old languages. Priests, diviners, exorcists, chanters, and scribes formed overlapping communities of expertise. Their work was not decorative. It held the relationship between city and cosmos in workable form. A ritual performed badly might be considered dangerous. A wrong recitation could distort meaning. A tablet copied carelessly might damage authority. Preservation demanded discipline. That much is grounded history. Temple and court scholars in Mesopotamia trained extensively. They copied texts, interpreted omens, performed rituals, guarded specialist knowledge, and preserved traditions over long stretches of time. Some compositions survived precisely because schools kept teaching them. Some languages survived as learned media even after they had ceased to be spoken daily. The keepers of fragments were therefore not peripheral. They were essential, but essential people also shape what survives. You sit in the half-light and imagine a damaged tablet brought from storage. One edge is broken. A line has vanished. The priest or scribe responsible for preserving its contents faces a problem familiar to scholars even now. How should the gap be treated? Leave it blank. Supply a known formula from another version. Harmonize it with current theology. Smooth the wording to fit ritual use. Each option preserves and alters at once. The ancient keeper is not inventing from nothing, but neither is he neutral. That is where the tension enters. Tradition appears ancient and fixed, yet every act of transmission passes through living hands. This is true of all cultures, but in Mesopotamia the effect is particularly powerful because the record is so materially visible. Tablets break, copies differ. Versions of myths shift across cities, centuries, and languages. Modern philologists reconstruct texts by comparing fragments and duplicates. That alone tells you something important. Ancient preservation was faithful, but not frozen. Perhaps that is why the oldest memories of humanity's creators, if such memories ever existed in more concrete form, survive only as atmospheric traces. It may be that priestly and scribal preservation favoured what could be integrated into ritual order. Names too obscure, explanations too unstable, or stories too disruptive might gradually be softened, allegorized, merged, or left uncopied. This would not require a conspiracy. It would require only reverence combined with institutional need. The keepers did not preserve everything. They preserved what could live. You move through the temple precinct in imagination, feeling the rough coolness of mud brick under your fingers where the night air has settled. The smell is a mixture of old incense, ash, stored grain, and oil. A doorway curtain shifts. Somewhere a basin reflects a small moon. In this place, memory would have felt sacred because it was difficult. To remember correctly was to honour the gods. But correct memory may have meant current correctness, not original completeness. That distinction matters. A priest serving a living cult does not preserve the past as a museum curator might. He preserves what sustains the present bond between divine and human order. A hymn may be old, but its value lies in present efficacy. A myth may contain ancient layers, but those layers are heard through current liturgical need. A king list may preserve deep antiquity, but it also supports contemporary legitimacy. In every case, fragments are carried forward because they still do work. Some scholars emphasize exactly this point. Mesopotamian texts were not static literature in the modern sense. Many were embedded in ritual, education, and administration. They lived because they were used. That makes them vivid. But it also means they were continually reframed by institutions. The ancient keepers were not archivists of lost truth so much as custodians of usable continuity. And usable continuity has edges. There is a curious fringe notion that temple elites deliberately hid the real origin of humanity behind coded myth. In its sensational form, the idea is thin and unsupported, but in a softer, more historical form, something related may be possible. Priesthoods and scholarly classes often mediate between raw cultural inheritance and acceptable public meaning. They do not need to be malicious to be transformative. Simply by deciding what is copied, taught, recited, and reconciled, they shape memory profoundly. You think of a long oral tale arriving at the tablet house after generations of retelling. Its older place names are obscure. Its founder figures no longer fit current theology cleanly. Its sequence is confusing. The temple scholar faced with such material might preserve its essence by mapping it onto known divine categories. A creator becomes an aspect of a familiar god. A lost sacred place becomes attached to a recognized city. A troubling ambiguity becomes a ritual formula. In this way, the story survives, though changed. The priest becomes not a liar, but a translator between ages. Scholarly uncertainty sits at the centre of all this. How much freedom did ancient scribes take with older material? How often were variants suppressed versus simply lost by chance? To what extent do surviving texts reflect elite theology rather than broader popular memory? The answers vary by period, text type, and location. Some compositions were copied conservatively, others were clearly adapted. The archive does not behave in one single way. That complexity is important because it keeps the night honest. There is no simple villain here, only custodianship under pressure. Outside the temple, wind moves through palm fronds with a dry, papery sound. A dog crosses the street and pauses beside a shadowed wall. The city is asleep enough now that each small noise seems deliberate. You begin to understand why fragments held by priests would feel more powerful than complete stories held by ordinary people. Fragmentation itself creates authority. A partial sacred text invites interpretation. A damaged tablet increases dependence on trained readers. A difficult language makes knowledge feel rarer. The keeper stands between the community and the oldest words. It may be that this position shaped humanity's memory of its own beginning more than our flood or conquest did. Perhaps the first creators, if remembered at all, survived only in pieces that required mediation. And once mediation became necessary, the mediators naturally translated the fragments into the language of the order they served. Over centuries, the translation became tradition. The tradition became orthodoxy. The orthodoxy became the oldest story later generations thought they had. This idea remains unproven, yet it fits something deeply human. Families do it. Religions do it. States do it. Communities inherit broken memory and stabilize it through trusted interpreters. That stabilization preserves identity, but it also narrows possibility. The past becomes survivable at the cost of some of its strangeness. You sit now near the temple wall as a faint draught cools the night. Inside, a keeper presses a final line into clay and sets the tablet aside to dry. In that small act there is both rescue and loss. A fragment has been saved. A fragment has been fixed. What it once was in fuller form may never return. Perhaps that is all the ancient priests could ever do. Perhaps it's also all they were meant to do, to carry forward enough of the old design for the city to remain aligned, to preserve the names that still had power, to let the rest sink quietly into sacred silence. And so the first creators, if humanity once knew them more clearly, may not have been erased by enemies or hidden in vaults. They may simply have passed through too many reverent hands. The farther you travel from Mesopotamia, the stranger the familiarity becomes. Different rivers, different skies, different languages, different gods, and yet certain shapes return, a first age closer to heaven, civilizing powers who teach humans how to live, floods that divide memory, kingship or sacred authority descending from above, humanity placed within an order that feels inherited rather than self-invented. You do not need every detail to match to feel the old pattern moving beneath the variations. It is like hearing the same melody played on unfamiliar instruments. Tonight you leave the cities of Sumer in thought and move outward across the ancient world. Not quickly, not in the modern way, but slowly, as if carried by rumour, trade, migration, and the long human habit of asking where order came from. You pass along coasts, across caravan routes, through mountain corridors, and into other ritual landscapes where the beginning of civilization is also described as something granted, not improvised. The air changes, the architecture changes, the names change, but the emotional structure remains uncannily close. This comparison has long interested scholars. Comparative mythology, when practiced carefully, can illuminate recurring themes without collapsing every culture into one story. Historians are right to warn against careless universalism. Similarity does not always mean direct connection. Human beings often generate parallel symbolic patterns because they share common concerns about authority, mortality, nature, and social life. Flood myths, civilizing heroes, divine lawgivers, and golden ages can arise independently or through broad regional exchange. The debate is ongoing and healthy. No single master key explains everything. Still, some patterns deserve attention precisely because they recur under different conditions. Take ancient Egypt. Egyptian kingship, like Mesopotamian kingship, was not merely political. It was sacred, cosmological, and rooted in maintenance of order. The concept of mat involved rightness, balance, and the proper structure of reality. Pharaoh did not simply govern people, he upheld the order of the world. That is grounded history and theology, though expressed through very different imagery from Sumer. Egypt's creation traditions also vary by locality, with different priestly centres emphasizing different divine beginnings, yet the result is similar in one important respect. The human realm stands within a prearranged order established by primordial powers. You move on to the Eastern Mediterranean, where memories of flood, destruction, and survival echo in Greek tradition. The Greek world is later and distinct, and it should not be flattened into Mesopotamian terms. Yet scholars have long studied the transmission of myths and motifs across the Near East and Mediterranean. Stories travel, structures travel. Sometimes what survives in one culture is transformed almost beyond recognition in another. A flood hero changes name, a divine craftsman acquires new attributes, a first age of gods and early rulers becomes heroic or poetic memory. Transmission is rarely direct enough to prove neatly, but cultural contact across long periods was real. Then there are the ancient traditions of teachers and bringers of order. In different civilizations, culture does not always emerge as a slow collective accident. It is often associated with figures who introduce writing, agriculture, law, ritual, architecture, astronomy, or kingship. Sometimes these figures are fully divine, sometimes they are demigods, sages, ancestors, or sainted rulers. Mainstream scholars usually explain this through the human tendency to personalize origins. Complex systems become easier to remember when attached to names. That makes sense. Yet the repeated appearance of such figures suggests that many cultures felt civilization as something received from a source beyond ordinary communal life. A particularly interesting parallel comes from the Mesopotamian tradition of Apkallu, the ancient sages associated in later texts with deep wisdom and early kings. These figures have fascinated both scholars and fringe interpreters. In mainstream scholarship, they are understood within the framework of Mesopotamian wisdom tradition, kingship ideology, and mythic memory. Later iconography and texts preserve them as beings of exceptional knowledge linked to order and civilization. Fringe readings sometimes turn them into literal lost teachers or non-human visitors, which goes beyond the evidence. Yet even without sensationalism, their presence matters. They embody the intuition that foundational knowledge enters the human realm through intermediaries. You begin to notice that this intuition is widespread. Not always the same intermediaries, not always the same story, but the same emotional logic. People often remember their beginnings as guided. This raises a serious scholarly question. Are these recurring patterns evidence of shared, deep cultural inheritance? Diffusion through contact? Or simply repeated human imagination responding to similar social transitions? The answer may differ case by case. Some motifs clearly travelled, others may have arisen independently. Comparative work remains difficult because evidence is uneven, and texts are context-bound. That uncertainty should not be hidden. It is part of the truth. Ancient traditions can resemble one another without proving a single original source, and yet the resemblance still matters for the quiet question you're carrying. If humanity was never meant to remember its first creators clearly, then one thing you might expect is not a single preserved account, but scattered echoes, fragments in different lands, similar roles under different names, a flood here, a lawgiver there, a first king elsewhere, an age of beings closer to divine order in another place altogether. No one culture would hold the full memory. Each would preserve a local adaptation. The original pattern would be visible only in outline, like a design seen through damaged copies. This idea remains speculative, but it has a certain emotional elegance. It explains why the echoes feel close without requiring them to be identical. It also respects the reality that ancient civilizations were not isolated. Trade, migration, conquest, diplomacy, and storytelling linked the ancient world in ways modern maps sometimes hide. Mesopotamia influenced and was influenced. Egypt absorbed and projected. The Levant transmitted. Anatolia blended. Iran reinterpreted. Over centuries, the old patterns moved. You rest now beside a fire in imagination. Somewhere along a route between worlds, the smoke smells of dry wood and animal fat. Above you, the stars seem unchanged from the skies over Sumer, though the language below them has shifted. A traveller tells a story of a flood. Another tells of a first ruler taught by the gods. Another speaks of sacred laws received from beyond ordinary men. No one tells the same tale, yet no one is entirely alone in what they remember. There is a curious fringe temptation to take these echoes and force them into one rigid hidden history. That approach usually fails because it ignores differences, compresses chronology, and treats poetic traditions as coded data. But the opposite mistake is possible too. If every resemblance is dismissed as coincidence or universal psychology, you may miss the way ancient cultures genuinely listen to one another across distance. The truth may lie in between. Shared human patterns, yes. Real transmission, also yes. Broken inheritance, perhaps. Perhaps that is why the oldest stories often feel more alike in structure than in detail. Structure travels well. Names do not. A civilizing power can become a god, a sage, a king, a culture hero, or a divine messenger depending on place and period. A flood can become judgment, reset, cleansing, or historical memory. The first creators can become too diffuse to identify, yet still leave humanity with the same impression. Order came from beyond us. It arrived before our own full self-awareness. We inherited it in forms already interpreted. The fire burns lower now, beyond it. The darkness of the ancient world stretches in every direction, full of separate peoples carrying related fragments. You begin to sense that humanity's first memory may never have been meant to survive in one language or one archive. It may have been broken early, carried widely, and translated constantly. And if that is true, then the silence around the first creators is not empty, it is crowded with echoes from distant civilizations, each one preserving just enough of the shape to make the forgetting feel deliberate, even if no single hand ever chose it. What troubles you most is not what the ruins reveal. It is what they keep. You feel that most strongly at an excavation site just before dawn, when the trench walls are still blue with early light and the air carries the cool smell of dust that has not yet warmed into day. Tools lie where the work stopped yesterday. A brush, a trowel, a bucket with dirt dried to its rim. The ground has been opened carefully, square by square, layer by layer, and yet so much remains hidden that the exposed area feels less like an answer than a wound in the earth. Archaeology is patient, disciplined, and astonishingly powerful. It can recover floor plans, hearths, pottery sequences, burial practices, botanical remains, animal bones, ceilings, industrial debris, and the subtle traces of daily life that texts rarely bother to notice. It can tell you where walls stood, when construction changed, how trade moved, what people ate, and how cities expanded or contracted. In Mesopotamia and the broader ancient Near East, generations of excavation have transformed human understanding of early civilization. This is one of the great intellectual achievements of modern scholarship. And still, archaeology is also a study of absence. A ruined wall can show you where a room once ended, but not always what was said inside it. A temple platform can reveal rebuilding phases, but not every reason later people believe the place remained sacred. A flood deposit can mark disruption, but not whether survivors interpreted it as divine judgment, cosmic reset, or ordinary misfortune. Even a tablet found in context tells only what someone chose to press into clay. The ground yields evidence. It does not yield complete intention. You crouch beside an exposed foundation where mud brick has survived only as stains and softened edges. The line of the wall is just visible, a geometry of persistence. Beyond it lies soil not yet excavated. That unseen space becomes strangely important in your thoughts. It is the physical form of historical restraint. Scholars can infer, compare, hypothesize, but they cannot command the buried world to speak beyond what remains. This is why the ancient past feels simultaneously intimate and unreachable. You can stand inches from it and still not know the most important thing. What was this place for in the minds of its first users? That question often refuses to answer cleanly. Take temples, for example. Archaeology can identify sacred architecture by plan, offerings, installations, and continuity of cultic use. Mesopotamian temple sites are among the most studied features of the ancient landscape. Yet even when a structure is clearly ritual in character, the full range of meanings attached to it may remain elusive. Was the earliest use already theological in a later sense, or more communal and local? Did a shrine begin as a practical marker of place, a burial association, a storeroom with ritual additions, or something else entirely? Scholars debate such issues cautiously because the evidence rarely allows total confidence. This uncertainty is not failure. It is part of the truth the ruins insist upon. Some places remain interpretal only in layers. A later city may have known exactly what a sanctuary meant in its own era, while being almost as distant from the first foundation as you are now. That means the ruin preserves not one silence, but several. The silence of the original builders, the silence of later inheritors who only partly understood them, the silence of modern readers arriving after both. You walk now across a field of broken mounds where no standing wall reaches above the grasses. The smell is dry, almost chalky, with faint sweetness from plants rooted in ancient debris. Somewhere nearby, a lark starts and then is gone. To the untrained eye, the landscape might seem empty. To an archaeologist, it is dense with possibility. Surface sherds, slight rises, soil discoloration, hidden architecture below. But even the trained eye must wait for method. It cannot leap to certainty. That is where a quiet discipline enters this story. Many unresolved questions about human origins, sacred beginnings, and early civilizations remain unresolved not because scholars lack imagination, but because good scholarship accepts the limits of evidence. Were some early sites more significant than current models allow? Possibly. Did certain traditions preserve memories older than writing? Almost certainly in some form. Can every impressive gap be filled with dramatic theories about forgotten creators? No. The ruins resist that. They refuse to reward impatience. And yet the resistance itself can be meaningful. Some have wondered whether the most important aspect of ancient beginnings is precisely what cannot be reconstructed in direct terms. Not a lost machine, not a hidden chamber, not one missing text that would solve everything, but a broader condition of partial recoverability. If humanity's earliest creators were transformed into gods, sacred offices, or mythic functions over time, then the archaeological record would not be expected to preserve a clean reveal. It would preserve cities built on older layers, cult sites of enduring prestige, repeated reconstruction, and a deeper symmetry between material continuity and explanatory clarity. In other words, exactly the kind of evidence we often have. That thought should be handled gently. It is a possibility, not a conclusion. The same archaeological pattern can be explained through ordinary cultural development, ritual continuity, and the sheer depth of prehistory. Still, the ruins do create a persistent emotional effect. They make it easy to believe that the most powerful truths of the earliest world may have been embedded in practice long after explanation was lost. Consider how often archaeologists uncover standardization without narrative, a repeated architectural orientation, similar offering vessels across generations, continuity in sacred precincts, repeated rebuilding on the same axis. The pattern is visible. The original rationale may not be, this is normal in archaeology, and scholars work carefully to interpret such continuities through context, but to the reflective mind, it suggests something haunting. Human beings can preserve forms faithfully even when the first meanings have thinned into habit. There is also the problem of what never survives well. Wood, reeds, textiles, skin, paint, song, gesture. The earliest worlds of Mesopotamia and its neighbours were built not only from durable things, but from perishable ones. Whole dimensions of life disappear almost completely unless preserved by extraordinary accident. That means the ruins are never neutral samples of the past. They are the durable remains of a once wider reality. If creators were remembered in spoken ritual, perishable iconography, or seasonal performances rather than stone or clay, the archaeological silence around them would be unsurprising. Scholars remain divided on many particular sites and chronologies. Was a given structure truly ritual in its first phase? How continuous was settlement at this mound? Does this destruction layer reflect invasion, fire accident, abandonment, or environmental stress? Such debates matter because they prevent the past from being overtided. A ruined site may invite one elegant theory. but the ground often prefers messy truth. That messiness is not disappointing. It is what keeps ancient history alive rather than decorative. The light is rising now. Workers will soon return to the trench. Brushes will move. Notes will be taken. Soil will be sieved. And another small section of silence will become description. But the larger silence will remain. The ruins give enough to sustain wonder, not enough to end it. That balance may be the deepest honesty the ancient world can offer. Perhaps the first creators are not absent because they were imaginary. Perhaps they are absent because history, especially deep history, does not preserve beginnings in the way later minds wish it would. It preserves repetition, location, hierarchy, reverence, reconstruction. It preserves the architecture of memory better than the first moment of remembering. And so the ruins continue to refuse the one thing you most want from them, a direct statement. Instead, they offer foundations without first intentions, sacred places without total explanation, and continuity without full comprehension. They do not tell you who the first creators were. They only show you how long human beings kept building as though someone important had once chosen the pattern. By now the question has moved inward. It is no longer only about tablets, kings, ruins, priests, or the names of gods. It is about you, and about the quiet possibility that humanity itself may function as a kind of archive, not a perfect one, not a biological hard drive carrying neat sentences from the beginning. Something softer than that. A creature shaped by habits, fears, longings, and sacred instincts that may preserve old arrangements long after their original explanation has disappeared. You feel this most clearly at night when the city has gone nearly silent and only the low human sounds remain. A child breathing in sleep, someone turning on a mat, a distant cough, the rustle of reed walls touched by wind. In such moments civilization seems to narrow to its simplest form: shelter, warmth, kinship, attention to unseen danger, need for blessing, need for continuity. Beneath the complexity of temple and palace lies the older human animal, listening in the dark for signs that the world is ordered, or at least not entirely abandoned. Perhaps that listening is itself a memory. Modern scholarship would express this carefully. Human beings inherit behavior through many channels at once: socialization, ritual, language, environment, institutions, bodily habits, emotional learning. Anthropology and archaeology alike show that culture can preserve structures of meaning over astonishing spans without any single person consciously understanding their full origin. A gesture continues because parents teach children. A festival survives because the calendar returns. A sacred place remains significant because the community keeps approaching it with reverence. None of this requires hidden supernatural programming. It requires continuity lived through bodies, and bodies remember differently from texts. A text can quote. A body repeats. A text explains. A body reacts. Long before writing, humans were already transmitting worlds through imitation, rhythm, taboo, care, craft, and fear. If the first creators of human order were ever remembered, perhaps they were remembered first not in explicit doctrines, but in embodied patterns, kneeling, offering, facing a direction, separating clean from unclean, ranking elders, assigning roles, reading signs in weather and sky, sleeping with one ear open to danger, gathering around fire to hear the story that makes duty bearable. You walk now through the sleeping quarter of an ancient city. The smell of ash lingers from banked cooking fires. A bowl sits beside a doorway. Laundry hangs motionless in the dark. Nothing here announces grand metaphysics, yet every small arrangement implies inherited understanding. People know where to place the lamp, when to speak quietly, how to greet the shrine, whom to obey, what to avoid, which story belongs to mourning and which to festival. The deepest order of a civilization is often not written law, but ordinary repetition. This is why the idea of humanity as inherited memory can feel more convincing than any dramatic hidden archive. The record may be fragmentary, but the species continues. Even when names change, The emotional structure can persist. Fear of chaos, reverence for origins, suspicion that knowledge should be mediated, longing for just rule, acceptance that work maintains the sacred world. These themes do not prove one original source, yet they return with remarkable persistence across time and place. It's possible that they endure because they solve practical social problems. It's also possible that they preserve much older impressions about how humanity first understood its place. Some have wondered whether myths are only the visible foam on a much deeper sea of inherited orientation. In that view, a civilization's stories may vary, but the underlying posture remains. Humans feel made for relationship to greater powers. Humans feel that order precedes them. Humans suspect that forgetting is dangerous but perhaps necessary. Humans return again and again to the notion that the world once stood closer to its source than it does now. Mainstream scholars might call these recurring symbolic structures rather than memories, and that is fair. Yet symbolic structures can still be carriers of ancient inheritance. A curious fringe idea sometimes claims that humanity contains buried ancestral knowledge waiting to be reactivated. In its louder versions, the idea drifts far from evidence, but in quieter form, it touches something real. People do carry forward old worlds in ways they cannot fully articulate. Ritual reflexes, moral intuitions, inherited fears, social rhythms, and the instinct to sacralize beginnings may all preserve traces of very old human organization. Not secret codes, exactly. More like pressure marks left by foundations long covered over. Scholarly uncertainty remains important here. It is difficult to separate universal human tendencies from particular historical inheritance. Are certain recurring themes present because all societies confront similar problems, or because ancient traditions influenced one another across generations? Are ritual hierarchies remembered from a specific deep past, or simply rediscovered repeatedly? The answer is probably mixed. Human nature and cultural transmission are not rivals. They work together. The species is both inventive and conservative. You sit now beside a low fire, watching it settle into coals. The warmth touches your hands while the rest of the air stays cool. This simple scene could belong almost anywhere in pre-modern time. That fact matters. Long stretches of human life were structured by repetition close to the body. Light ended at sunset. Labour followed season. Kinship shaped survival. Sacred story explained risk. In such a world, the deepest beliefs about order would not feel abstract. They would feel as immediate as the need to secure water, bread, and protection. Perhaps that is why the oldest human questions never seem fully modern. Who made the order? Why are we subject to it? Why is knowledge partial? Why do we work? Why does memory fade? These questions may be ancient not just because texts record them, but because human life itself keeps producing them from within inherited structures. If the first creators were forgotten, their most lasting trace may not be a surviving tablet at all. It may be the recurring human sensation that life arrives already arranged. That sensation deserves more respect than modern people sometimes give it. To feel that the world is preordered is not automatically ignorance. In ancient societies, it was often a rational response to living inside institutions, ecologies, and ritual systems far older than oneself. A child born into temple life or royal law would naturally experience order as something received. Over centuries, that feeling could become nearly species-wide in civilizations shaped by sacred hierarchy. It would survive changes in language and myth because it lived in posture before it lived in explanation. Night has become very still now. The fire sinks lower. The city seems almost to be listening with you. You begin to sense that inherited memory may not mean remembering facts from the beginning. It may mean carrying the emotional contour of the beginning without being able to name its first actors, a longing toward origins, a distrust of total freedom, a reverence for transmitted forms, a recurring suspicion that the visible world is the maintained version of something older. These are not proofs, they are textures. But textures matter in stories like this because they are often what remains after details are lost. Perhaps humanity itself is the last fragment. Not humanity as a biological mystery to be solved by one revelation, But humanity is a vessel that keeps repeating old arrangements long after the first reason for them has gone quiet. And if that is true, then to ask about the first creators is already to feel their absence working inside you. You remember them, perhaps the way the body remembers an old wound. Not in words, in shape. By the end, the first creators may not have disappeared. They may simply have receded. That feels different. Less like a violent eraser, more like figures walking farther and farther into mist until only their outlines remain behind the structures they once set in place. You can imagine it now with a kind of tired calm, not a dramatic disappearance, not a final war in heaven, not one clear act of forgetting, only distance increasing generation by generation while rituals continue, cities rebuild, names shift, and people inherit the pattern without meeting its first makers face to face. You stand in imagination at the edge of a temple roof in the hour before dawn. The city is below you in muted tones. Mud brick terraces, dark lanes, tethered animals, sleeping households, canal water holding faint stars. Nothing in the scene looks abandoned. Life goes on, yet the gods, or whatever earliest authorities once stood nearest the beginning, feel very far away. Their presence is now mostly institutional, a shrine, a title, a calendar day, a hymn, a processional route, a royal claim. Their nearness has become form. That transformation is one of the most historically plausible things you have considered all night. Across ancient civilizations, divine and ancestral figures often become less immediate over time, even while their cults and names endure. Religious systems bureaucratize. Ritual becomes standardized. The intimate strangeness of origin softens into inherited orthodoxy. Historians see this in many traditions. A founding event becomes a liturgy. A remembered presence becomes doctrine. A local power becomes universal theology. Continuity survives, but immediacy fades. Mesopotamia offers many examples of this broad tendency. Early sacred centers become embedded in larger political systems. Older local traditions are absorbed into expanding pantheons. Sumerian forms are preserved in learned contexts, while later imperial structures reinterpret them. Kings claim ancient sanction through restoration rather than direct encounter. Even where divine presence remains intensely real in ritual terms, it is mediated through established institutions, trained personnel, and inherited symbols. This is not the raw edge of beginnings. It is civilization remembering its source through distance. Perhaps that is what happened to the first creators. If there were once figures or powers beneath later theology that human communities related to more directly, it may be that they did not vanish in fact. It may be that they became too remote to distinguish from the sacred order itself. Once a presence no longer acts as a conversational partner in communal memory, it begins to function differently. Its name may survive, but as office, its image may survive, but as emblem, its authority may survive, but through systems rather than encounters. In this way, a creator can remain central while becoming almost unrecognizable. You walk now through a sanctuary just before first light. The lamps have nearly burned out. Oil lingers in the air with the faint sweetness of old incense. A priest sleeping in a side chamber will soon wake to wash, dress, and begin the day's first rites. The schedule is intact. The rites are meaningful. But somewhere beneath them lies a quieter thought. What if the forms remain because once, long ago, they were responses to something much more immediate than later generations could imagine? This is not impossible historically. Many rituals outlive the conditions that produced them. Anthropologists and historians alike have seen how repeated acts survive changes in belief, language, and political structure. A community can continue a gesture long after forgetting why it first mattered. Sacred life is especially prone to this because repetition itself becomes meaningful. The ritual no longer needs its original explanation to justify itself. It has become tradition. That may be the gentle mechanism by which creators fade without being denied. A community continues to build the temple, continue the hymn, continue the calendar, continue the titles, Continue the obligations. Over time, the first source becomes less a remembered being than the reason these forms must never be interrupted. Some fringe theories insist that ancient gods were once literal rulers remembered dimly after withdrawal, in their loudest form. Such theories go too far and ignore the symbolic, literary, and ritual complexity of the evidence. Yet in a softened sense, the intuition behind them is not wholly unreasonable. Ancient traditions do often preserve the sense that higher powers were once closer to the human world than they are now. Whether those powers were theological, ancestral, political, or some blend of all three is the harder question. Scholars remain divided because evidence rarely settles such matters beyond doubt. What can be said with confidence is that distance itself becomes a religious fact. The more ancient a source, the more reverence it acquires, and often the less directly it can be described. This is true in texts, in temple rebuilding, in kingship ideology, and in mythic chronology. The beginning becomes holier as it becomes less accessible. That is not accidental. Distance protects significance. You sit now against a warm outer wall as the first hint of morning touches the horizon. The bricks release stored heat slowly. Somewhere within the temple precinct, someone has begun to move. A door bar is lifted. A vessel is set down. The city prepares to resume the pattern. Watching this, you start to understand that fading away may have been the natural destiny of any first creator in a civilization built on continuity. To remain too visible would invite comparison, criticism, and change. To become distant is to become unchallengeable. Perhaps the first makers were remembered best when they were no longer remembered as personalities at all. It is possible that they passed into divine abstractions, sacred roles, or cosmic principles because these forms could survive the collapse of names. A local founder could be forgotten, a god of wisdom could endure, a historical organizer could vanish, kingship from heaven could remain, a lost teacher could disappear, civilization as gift could still be taught, scholarly uncertainty remains, as it should. There is no single text that narrates this fading in literal terms. No tablet says, once we knew them clearly, and now we know only their offices. Yet that pattern is implied across much of the ancient record. The oldest sources are nearest the mystery, and often the hardest to interpret. Later sources are clearer in structure, but farther from the original pulse. The creator becomes easier to worship and harder to identify. That may be why so much of ancient religion feels simultaneously intimate and remote. You can serve the god. You can praise the god. You can rebuild the god's house. You can never quite reach the first moment when that power entered human memory. The sky's brightening now from black to blue-grey. Birds begin in the reeds. Smoke starts to rise from the first household fires. Another day in the city begins beneath a structure already old when yesterday ended. You watch it all and to feel an unexpected tenderness toward the people who lived inside such distance. They did not fail to remember. They remembered in the only way durable civilizations often can, by letting the source withdraw into form, by preserving order after presence had thinned, by continuing the world as if the first creators still mattered, even when no one could point to them clearly anymore. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps fading away was not the tragedy. Perhaps it was the method by which the makers remained. There is one last possibility you have not yet fully sat beside. That forgetting was not merely a failure, that it may, in some strange and quiet way, have been necessary. You feel the weight of that idea in the final hour before sunrise, when the city is neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and the world seems suspended between what has ended and what is about to begin again. The canal lies dark and still. Roof lines are only outlines. A temple lamp burns somewhere within thick walls, but from here you cannot see it directly. You know it is there because the order of the city requires it. That is how much of ancient life must have felt. Certain things were hidden, yet trusted. Certain things were never shown, yet treated as essential. Perhaps memory worked the same way. All night you have followed fragments, systems, names, ruins, translated gods, buried foundations, and the possibility that humanity inherited an order older than the first written civilizations could fully explain. But one question remains more unsettling than all the others. If there really were earlier creators, founders, or ordering powers dimly preserved beneath later myth, why would their memory fade into such partial forms? Why would human beings carry the structure while losing the explanation? One answer is simple erosion. Time destroys, floods bury, languages change, institutions rewrite. That answer is probably true in large part. Historians and archaeologists do not need hidden intention to explain why ancient memory grows fragmentary. Yet once you step into the emotional logic of old civilizations, another answer becomes imaginable. Too much memory can be destabilizing. Not every truth helps a society remain whole. This is a deeply ancient idea. Mesopotamian culture, like many others, treated knowledge as powerful and often dangerous. Ritual precision mattered. Omens required skilled interpretation. Divine decrees were not casual information. A human being who knew too much without proper place or training could upset sacred balance. This is grounded in the broad structure of ancient knowledge systems, even if not every text states it directly. Awareness and responsibility were linked. Access had to be managed. If that was true for ritual knowledge, might it not also have been true for origin knowledge? It may be that early societies, consciously or unconsciously, softened the memory of first creators because stark remembrance would have damaged the human relationship to order. Imagine a people told too clearly that their roles were assigned by powers now absent, unreachable, or indifferent. Imagine the burden of knowing that the system was inherited from authorities no living generation could consult. Some might submit more deeply, others might lose trust, still others might challenge the entire structure. Ambiguous memory, by contrast, allows reverence without paralysis. The creators can become gods. The system can remain sacred. The city can continue. That possibility is speculative, but it fits the logic of cultural survival. Communities do not preserve information only because it is true. They preserve what helps life remain meaningful and manageable. A story can be incomplete and still be socially wiser than a more direct one. Perhaps that is why myths so often protect humanity from the full sharpness of its own beginnings. They turn origin into ritual form, not raw exposure. You walk now past sleeping houses toward the edge of the city where cultivated land fades into open dark. The earth feels cool. The smell is damp and mineral from the canal bank. In the distance, reeds move with the faintest dry hiss. Out here, away from walls and chants and official spaces, the thought becomes even quieter. Maybe forgetting is part of how human beings remain human. If memory reached too far back, if the first ordering powers remain too vivid, ordinary life might become unbearable. Work, marriage, harvest, grief, and small acts of kindness all require some shelter from the full abyss of beginnings. Ancient traditions may have understood this better than modern ones do. A flood divides time. A god speaks through signs, not unfiltered presence. A king receives legitimacy through ritual, not direct access to primordial truth. Priests guard fragments. Scribes copy formulae. Common people inherit practice more than explanation. All of these arrangements create distance, and distance can be protective. It lets a civilization hold holiness without being consumed by it. There is an unusual fringe idea that humanity was intentionally made to forget in order to remain obedient. In its harsher versions, this becomes too blunt, too mechanical, and too certain to be satisfying. The evidence does not support such clean claims, but in gentler form, the thought remains worth considering. It is possible that societies themselves cultivate forgetting, because total remembrance threatens cohesion, not a sinister plot, but a collective instinct. Memory is reduced to what can be born. Scholars, of course, would phrase this differently. They might speak of mythic transformation, selective transmission, ideological reframing, and the social function of tradition. Those are valuable terms, and they keep the subject grounded. Yet their emotional meaning is close to the older intuition. A civilization does not hand every generation the whole burden of its past. It passes on shapes, rites, authorities, and softened narratives. It preserves enough for continuity, not enough for collapse. You think of children in the ancient world learning gestures before explanations, how to bow, how to carry an offering, which day belongs to which god, what words must not be spoken carelessly. What adults seem to know but say only in part, every civilization teaches in layers. At the outer edge are habits, deeper in are stories, deeper still are specialist meanings, and below even that there may be no clear memory at all, only the conviction that one must continue the pattern respectfully. Perhaps that layered teaching is the true form of intentional forgetting, not destruction of knowledge, graduation of knowledge until the deepest origin passes beneath all categories. That would explain why humanity seems to remember its first creators only through indirect pressure, through sacred order, through inherited obligation, through the feeling that freedom is real but never original, through the recurrent belief that civilization was received in portions, through the instinct to treat beginnings as too holy or too dangerous to expose plainly. Morning is beginning to gather now. The eastern horizon is pale. The city is only moments from sound. A door will open, someone will fetch water, smoke will rise, bread will be shaped, a hymn will be said because a hymn has always been said, and the people will live inside a pattern they did not create from nothing, perhaps never knowing whether the deepest mercy of that pattern lies in what it teaches or in what it withholds. It may be that forgetting mattered because memory can imprison as easily as it can illuminate. It may be that the first creators became distant not only because history is fragile, but because humanity required a veil between itself and the full force of origin. It is possible that this veil allowed ritual to replace terror, duty to replace confusion, and ordinary life to continue beneath a sky still haunted by beginnings. If so, then forgetting was never the opposite of inheritance. It was the form inheritance had to take, a softened memory, a protective distance, a sacred dimming, and in that dimness, humanity could go on building temples, raising children, sowing fields, and telling stories, while the oldest truth remained just far enough away to keep the world livable. In the end, no stone opens and no buried voice explains everything. The night simply grows quieter around you, and what remains is not a solution, but an image. A city sleeping under stars, a temple lamp hidden behind thick walls, reeds moving along black water, mud brick resting on older mud brick, shrine upon shrine, name upon name, order continuing even after the first reasons for it have gone dim. You came looking for the earliest creators of humanity, or at least for the memory of them. What you found instead was a world built to preserve pattern more faithfully than explanation. That may be the closest thing to an answer the ancient past is willing to offer. You stand now in imagination beyond the city, at the edge of field and canal, where the first hint of dawn touches the horizon so lightly it almost seems imagined. The air is cool and smells of wet clay, reeds, ash, and distant bread ovens being prepared for morning. Behind you, the city still sleeps, but not entirely. There is movement inside it already. A priest rising to wash, a labourer turning beneath a wool blanket, a woman stepping into the courtyard before the others wake. Life is about to begin again within a structure older than any one person can hold in mind. That is what human civilization has so often been. A continuation no one fully originates. Across the long hours of this story, you have followed traces through archaeology, myth, kingship, temple economy, buried foundations, translated gods, guarded knowledge, repeated ruin, and inherited form. Each path led toward the same quiet impression. Ancient people often lived as though order had arrived before them. They inherited roles, sacred geographies, and systems of meaning that seemed too old, too complete, and too authoritative to have been invented by ordinary memory alone. Mainstream history explains much of this through the rise of institutions, the power of ritual, and the nature of urban civilization. Those explanations deserve trust. They are careful, evidence-based, and necessary. Yet even within that grounded framework, something unresolved remains. Why do the oldest written civilizations so often look backward with the feeling of lateness? Why do they preserve beginnings as fragments, distances, decrees, and sacred distributions rather than simple acts of invention? Why does humanity so often appear not as the author of the first order, but as its inheritor? Perhaps the answer is only that human beings are always born into worlds already arranged. Children enter families, laws, languages, calendars, and expectations they did not design. Cities rise atop older settlements. Religions preserve names older than their current meanings. Knowledge is transmitted in layers, never all at once. It may be that the ancient myths of first creators are only large and beautiful expressions of this ordinary truth. That is the most restrained reading, and it carries real force. But perhaps there is a softer mystery inside it too. It may be that long before recorded history, before the first cities we can name, humanity passed through formative ages now almost entirely beyond recovery. Not necessarily ages of impossible machines or theatrical revelations, but ages of deep ordering. Times when labour, sacred authority, social role, and cosmic explanation were set into forms later generations inherited without fully recalling their origin. If so, then the first creators may survive not as persons we can identify with confidence, but as the hidden architects of patterns that outlive direct memory. Some have wondered whether the gods of the ancient world are, among other things, the final shelters of forgotten beginnings, not falsehoods, not disguises in a crude sense, more like vast names into which older memories settled once they could no longer remain local, personal, or historically clear. Scholars cannot confirm such a theory. The evidence is too partial, the texts are too layered, the archaeological record is too uneven. Still, the possibility has a quiet dignity. It honours both the caution of history and the haunting persistence of the human imagination. You turn back toward the city as the sky slowly lifts from charcoal to grey. A bird starts in the reeds, far off. A jar lid clicks against stone. Someone opens a door. The world does not end with revelation. It resumes with repetition. That, perhaps, is the final lesson. Human beings may never recover the first creators as a complete memory, because complete memory is not what civilizations are built to carry. Civilizations carry form, ritual, office, obligation, place. They carry enough to continue the world, and maybe that was always the intention. Not that humanity should know everything about its beginning, only that humanity should keep the pattern alive, so you leave the night with no hard conclusion, only this fading image. Beneath every temple lies older earth. Beneath every sacred name lies older meaning. Beneath every human order lies some first arrangement now dim with time. Whether those first creators were gods, remembered founders, lost authorities, or simply the vanished human past transformed by reverence, they remain just beyond clear recall, not absent, not fully present, only hidden in the way a foundation is hidden, carrying everything, seen by almost no one. Word count 1159. For a little while longer, stay here at the edge of the waking plain. The sky is becoming pearl grey now, and the first true light spreads softly across the canal. Reeds bend and straighten in the breeze. Water holds a pale reflection of morning. Behind you, the city is stirring in the smallest ways, with footsteps in courtyards, a gate unbarred, the muffled sound of clay vessels being moved into place. No revelation arrives with the dawn, only the tender return of ordinary life, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the oldest truths were never meant to be held all at once, but only approached in fragments, the way you approach them tonight, through broken tablets, through ruined walls, through myths that preserved shape better than detail, through the feeling that human beings live inside patterns older than memory, and that the world often feels inherited before it feels understood. As the light grows, the mystery does not vanish, it only becomes gentler. The first creators, whatever they were, remain where the deepest things often remain, beneath names, beneath ritual, beneath daily labour, beneath the simple human instinct to continue. You may never know them clearly, but you can sense their outline in the way civilizations kept rebuilding, kept remembering in part, kept turning sacred order into something livable. The birds are louder now, smoke rises in thin blue lines, the stars have faded almost completely, So let the question soften. Let the old cities rest where they are, under layers of dust and story. Let the earliest makers remain partly hidden. And let yourself drift with the quiet thought that perhaps not everything unfinished is lost. Some things remain incomplete so they can keep whispering. End of script. Good night.